It's fantastic to be here with everyone. What a huge crowd already, and it's very nice to be here with you for this X Series 73. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And I guess it's been kind of a crazy week.
Oh, God, is
politically.
it ever?
We got Roger Stone, who's been indicted, and which is pretty funny when you think about it, right? They can get people like Stone, but Hillary Clinton scatters away. But nobody's going to cry any crocodile tears over Stone. But it is interesting the way that system of justice works when it wants to, selectively. So always good to keep in mind. Now, tonight, speaking of justice, we have some very interesting news in terms of the JFK assassination, which we're coming up now to the, this is the 56th anniversary coming up on the 22nd. And still all the records from this case haven't been released, and still the government clings to the ridiculous Warren Commission notion. And, researchers have broken past that. And so now it's a joke. So when you hear things like the magic bullet or things like that, it's part of a punchline. Or, the patsy, we all sort of know. It's like Epstein didn't kill himself. I guess Oswald was the original Epstein, although he was sort of taken out in front of live TV. So we start to get into this slightly schizophrenic situation between the public and the official story. Now, tonight's episode is all about that and contains some really interesting news about the JFK assassination and the forces around it, and where some stealth archives may surface in Canada that will shed a lot of light on the JFK assassination and the larger picture of a company called Permindex, which we've touched on lightly in a few episodes, and this time is a much deeper dive. Permindex is a company that is largely set up by fascists to move money around the world, and was headquartered in Switzerland and in Montreal. So getting into this company, we're going to find a great deal of intelligence assets and CIA control and money laundering and money moving across borders. And that is going to tie in dramatically with this information that's come forward now, an active case that's taking place in Canada for the records of someone named Louis Bloomfield, who ran Permindex, and whose records should have been available to the public in 2004. But his widow at the time asked for a 50-year extension. It was temporarily granted a 25-year extension, then that was overturned. Some records came out in 2018, but the large majority was again rebuffed for another 10 years. And so we're in this strange seesaw motion. But the question is, why would anybody want to keep these records back? So we're going to have to get into a lot about Permindex tonight. What's interesting is that in the original period of the JFK assassination in the 1960s, there was a DA from New Orleans named Jim Garrison, who, because New Orleans had been the sort of hub of activity for the accused assassin Lee Oswald in 1963, in that summer, he had decided he was going to look into the case. And originally he did some digging around, and the FBI rebuffed him and said, we're not interested. And he sort of went cold on it and was like, all right, I'll forget about it too. But when the Warren Commission, which is the official word on the assassination, came out, he went through it and realized just how many lies were in there and figured out something was terribly wrong. So opened his own clandestine investigation, even though he was the DA of New Orleans. He had the right to investigate it, but he didn't do it publicly or for attention or for a book or anything like that. It is because of Garrison's work and a few other researchers that we have something on record which may actually give us the answer in that case and show us a much larger program that broke out of this whole power struggle of that period into what we're facing here with this kind of gigantic dominance from space. So this is where we're going right now when we look at all these things around space and the space economy and control from space and satellites and all the rest of it. A lot of the setup for that battle and the ethics that were going to be used took place in this period, and the Kennedy assassination was kind of the fulcrum of this entire struggle. And we've been dealing with a number of repercussions. So in a way, for this kind of space showdown that we're facing with the transhumanism coming in through space, controlling things on the ground, kind of global control grid, where everything is monitored from space, and with the use of satellites and suborbital surveillance techniques, you're going to be, every transaction is going to go through there. You're going to have all that capability, but they're going further with it now, and that's why you're hearing so much about space. So that's why these things are going to really collide tonight. And so we've put in the title NASA, Nazis, JFK, Permindex. They're all interrelated if we're going to understand the structure that we're dealing with. And so that's why tonight's going to be particularly good setup for us coming into this special anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, who, by the way, walked us away from a major nuclear confrontation in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the world sort of owes him this debt of bringing us back from the brink. And so tonight he'll get a little bit of payback on that. How's it going out there?
It's going great. And I wanted to say 13 Days, although it is a flawed movie, really shows what a challenge it was for Kennedy. And if anybody hasn't seen it out there, you really should.
Well, remember, too, that once you get into Cuba, you're dealing with hot zone. There's a lot of hot zone activity tonight as well, even though the center of this is in Montreal. We're going to find the people who were involved in all these cases in Guatemala and Honduras and setting up governments there. So we're always, when we're dealing with these things, we always end up in the hot zone, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. But this is kind of the good thing about having the larger picture and not just falling for a lot of the traditional stories that come out about the JFK assassination. Well, there was a Cuban agent over here, and he said that there were some angry Cubans, and they got together. Maybe they did something. And the mafia was upset. Well, the mafia can't cover up a crime for 60 years from the government. It's ridiculous. And those are, we have to understand the echelon, if you have a baseball team, you have a coach, you have players, you have first base coach, you have trainers, you have relief pitchers, you have designated hitters. So if you have, when you think about the mafia or something like that, they're just people who are hired. They're people who are sent in and hired by groups. And who was using groups like the mafia in that period? The Central Intelligence Agency was using the mafia. They were using them for assassinations of foreign leaders. That's an entire program that's on the record now. When we hear a lot of specials like that and we get into that mindset, it's distraction time. And then you have all these ridiculous shows that try to go over the history of Camelot and all that, and just gloss over anything that Kennedy was actually trying to do, and just say, wasn't he idealist? But I guess he was just too idealist. Mm-hmm. And, it's tough luck. We didn't deserve that. Oh, he was too glamorous. What a time it was. His wife really dressed well. And so, yeah. I mean, no, it was a civil war. One side won by taking out the other side. And you've been living with the repercussions for 56 years. Now, we can't live in the past trying to avenge this great crime. But what we can do, the way disinformation works, especially government disinformation from clandestine organizations, is it's like a spool. And, we think we understand things about the Epstein case now. Really, it's probably going to take something like a decade for people to really understand what's going on there. The Kennedy assassination, because there have been those researchers, people like Professor Scott, who've gone into it and shown us the drug connections in relation to intelligence groups. A lot of their priorities have to do with what they can get away with their own foreign policy. So I think it's important to understand that over 56 years, things start to unwind. And there's that type of misinformation becomes a little more open because we're able to see it better and we get more clarity on what it is. You might, if your research is really good, be able to get a glimpse of how it affects things now. And that's the balance that we're after here. I do feel like it's important to not look at it as, well, there was the Kennedy assassination, but we need to move on. It's that when you have a complete record, a complete history, you are always moving on, because you understand what the past is all about in relation to the present and how those forces got set up. If you don't, then you're going to get sucker punched with a false flag later, and then they're going to trot out some guy and say, well, he killed this leader, but he was mentally disturbed, and these were his motivations. And you'll deal with tons of media organizations telling you BS for years and years, as they did with the Kennedy assassination, with a straight face. Now, the official story of the Kennedy assassination falls apart, especially with the information we have now. Even in the 60s, it fell apart because there were a number of factors involved in the official story that were absurd. The idea that Oswald would happen to be this Kennedy hater communist who got placed in this building right on the motorcade route, and he only got there 6 weeks earlier. Just so happened to have the rifle and shot him and got a great shot. So he has all this incredible luck, right? But it turns out none of that happened. And when we look at I'm going to start with a few intricacies of the case because it's very interesting to think about who's involved in just the basic setup. And there are doubles of Oswald even at the scene of the crime. So, we have already the setting up scenario going on. But the building itself is something I want to start with. The Texas School Book Depository is a place where Oswald was making $1.25 an hour. Oswald was an ex-Marine who was living right outside of Dallas. And he had been in the Soviet Union, defected to the Soviet Union, come back with a Russian wife, and had one child and one on the way. So he was 24 years old, and he had a very unusual past growing up at times in orphanages when his mother couldn't afford him. And his father died before he was born. So he had this very scattered upbringing. And he had lived in places as far-flung as New York, New Orleans, Texas, and he had a scattered record of different schools and a kind of a very tricky upbringing. But what's interesting is when good researchers have gotten their hands on Oswald records going into the past, what we've seen is that Oswald seems to be in two places at once very often. That is, there are school records of him in Texas, there are school records of him in New York at the same time. So these things are never well reconciled, and researchers have been like, this two Oswalds thing over and over again. Part of this with Oswald is something in intelligence work that's called a legend, where you need to have somebody be kind of ubiquitous for what you want to do with them, and you leave all your options open. So you're always having them identified as someone else. And in the way of the official story, Oswald has nothing to do with intelligence units. He has nothing to do with the FBI or anything. In reality, he's a deep player in the Central Intelligence Agency, and they're very well aware of him, which, of course, they deny to this day. But there's lots of things on the record which just show it. I mean, it's just inevitable. Now, I do feel that the official version of the story really needs to be thrown out in order for us to see the past properly, but also to go forward with transformation and the kind of transparency that we really need. If you don't get it, you go round and round, and then things like Iran-Contra show up and 9/11 show up, and you just keep going into this cycle and circle. And God knows where they're headed with it now, with Vaccine Agenda 101, right? It'll be like, there's a biological weapon that got exploded, and you need to take this vaccine now.
It's coming.
Yeah, it's inevitable. It has that kind of a setup. However, I think that these types of forces back off when awareness hits, and some of them are kamikaze, and they want to come in and they lose. We've seen it before. We've seen Ebola scares and things like that go fall flat. We've seen big gun grabs and things like that. And all of these things, of course, have their balancing factor. But we're talking about really, kind of what you'd refer to as genuine false flag operations. And that's the way I think we have to look at this. So let's take a look. I like starting in with Oswald because we're going to see that a lot of the disinformation around Oswald ties into these forces that we're going to get at in Permindex and that Garrison ran into. And it was, in fact, Oswald's case that bothered Garrison the most in the beginning. it started to be obvious to him, who was a former military man, that this just didn't add up. He was also an FBI investigator, so he understood. But here he was DA, and he started to find out that Oswald was associated with someone named Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister was a right-wing guy, so that didn't make any sense either. Guy Bannister had very unusual background, including being the first UFO researcher for the FBI. So the whole story gets very interesting when you look at it for real. Now let's take a look at Oswald briefly here. That's Oswald at age 15 in the Civil Air Patrol. And, the Civil Air Patrol was founded by somebody named D.H. Byrd. Now, it's very interesting to think about D.H. Byrd, because one of the things that we've learned about D.H. Byrd, who was a Texas oil man, is that he owned the Texas School Book Depository building where all the shots were fired on Kennedy's motorcade. Now, what's interesting is there's a lot of strange security stripping that takes place the day of the Kennedy assassination, and there he is driving with Governor Connolly in the front. And right off the bat, when they're at the airport, members of the Secret Service, who are usually on the back of the car, get told by the head of the Secret Service to get off the back of the car. Well, it's interesting because if they were on the back of the car, then the shots and all that stuff, the ricocheting shots from the front and the back, obviously it wouldn't have been smooth. So you have to get these guys off the back of the car. Now that's on record, and it's filmed as they take off from Love Field. It's never been explained well, and a lot of the excuses for it just don't add up. What's more likely is there's security stripping inside of the Secret Service for the groups that are preparing to make this motion to remove Kennedy. We're going to see why they did that. By the time Kennedy is in Dealey Plaza, he's being shot at, and he will be fatally wounded in the car that was shot from the front, actually with two shots from the front. And for years, the media and the Warren Commission will keep alive the story. Oh, it was one lucky shot from the back that went through everybody.
Right, 7 wounds.
Yeah, 7 wounds from the magic bullet. And then the bullet magically appears on a stretcher in Parkland Hospital. The only problem is it appears on the wrong stretcher, so whoever was set up to put that there made a mistake. But there's so many little things about that just unravel the case. So let's just say that the case is unraveled. I did a documentary on it called Agent Oswald, the CIA Patsy. That'll show you how the case just unravels and how Oswald was an intelligence agent who's placed there in the Texas School Book Depository. Now, in the work of people like Professor Peter Dale Scott, who've looked into the John F. Kennedy assassination, some of the things that he found in the trails leading up to the assassination with Oswald is that he felt that Oswald was being used as a low-level intelligence asset to track programs having to do with purchasing firearms illegally over state lines. And so a lot of the things about him using names like A.J. Hidell or ordering a rifle through the mail, which is trackable, is part of the setting up process. Because, of course, in Texas, you can just walk into a store and buy a gun with no ID at the time and say, I'll take it. And they just, they'll sell it to you on the spot. So there's no reason for this elaborate thing of like, hey, we found this P.O. box he was ordering sporting goods rifles from and all that stuff. And then they've got the wrong rifle as well, as we know, because the rifle that they supposedly find in Oswald's garage is a Mannlicher Carcano rifle, but the one that is originally found, and people like Roger Craig and Seymour Weitzman are the first cops on the scene, look at the barrel of the gun that they find on the 6th floor, and it's a Mauser, German Mauser. So 7.65 Mauser, they recount it. And that's also in my documentary. So those facts are there. So the official story is just throw it out the window. It doesn't hold any light. They lied. And now you could say, why did they lie? Was everyone in on it? Or did they just accept the story on the media side because they knew a new regime was coming in, one that wasn't voted in? And so this is basically how it played out. And, the voices that were dissenting came about in the 60s. And there were people like Mark Lane, who was a lawyer who Oswald's mother had originally contacted to rep him. They didn't allow Oswald to have a lawyer for the 3 days that he was alive. He was interrogated, but no notes were taken. You know, how often do you see that? So it's a very unusual freak show of a case. And then finally, under incredible security circumstances, Jack Ruby, who's a mafia gun runner and has done intel work before and been in Cuba and all these other places, he shows up madcap and shoots him with all these, 40 cops carrying Oswald out. It's an impossible scenario. And then he's thinking, well, I'm going to claim insanity and get off, or somebody's told him something along this line. But he's set up for the hit, and then he dies in prison of a fast-acting cancer. And when he gets a retrial a couple of years later, he dies of cancer, and that's the end of it. One of the things that he says is that a whole new form of government is going to rise up, and the people who put me in this position are in high places, and so on. He makes a number of very unusual statements, shall we say. So that's the story of Jack Ruby. But Oswald, being in the Texas School Book Depository and this D.H. Byrd owning the Texas School Book Depository is interesting because D.H. Byrd set up the Civil Air Patrol, and Oswald was in the Civil Air Patrol when he was 15. This is a very important piece of information. D.H. Byrd is somewhat nicknamed Dry Hole Bird because he was an oil man, but a bad one. Nonetheless, he was a millionaire, especially when he invested in a company that made helicopters. And when he invested in the company, it was just previous to the JFK assassination, and it was estimated in 3 years he made somewhere to the tune of $50 million back then, based on the fact that with Kennedy out, the wars went forward and helicopters were in high demand. But there are even stranger things about our friend D.H. Byrd. One is that Byrd is the cousin of Admiral Richard Byrd, who went to Antarctica. And now it's very interesting about Admiral Byrd because Admiral Byrd's brother is Harry Byrd, Senator Harry Byrd, who controls the CIA purse strings, and in combination with LBJ, who controlled NASA purse strings, there's this CIA NASA money going on between the two. So the Byrds, and what they call the Byrd machine in Virginia, they are a very established political force. But in the middle of that, you have this very established Admiral Byrd, who had really changed things and been a genuine hero as an explorer and a polar explorer. But a very strange thing happens to him, and when we're getting into the 40s now, which is there's a exploration which is Operation High Jump, where he goes to map out Antarctica, and he's working with people inside the government who will be associated with the UFO file, like James Forrestal, who's also very close to JFK because they're both Catholic, and he's the first defense secretary of the United States. So when we're looking at some of these connections, it's very interesting to note that when Admiral Byrd comes back early, he gives an interview where he says, the next world war we're facing is not with Russians or Germans, but it's what these discs that were all over the place and went down to Antarctica. We had to get out of there. So he witnessed a number of flying discs. There have been all kinds of theories about what was down there. Was it a Nazi base? Did they have this advanced technology? Is it an off-world civilization? What was it that he encountered? It's not well explained. And he had to shut up about it after the fact. But his interview's on record, and there we go. Now, in terms of what he encountered, that's all very interesting. But one of the things that's unusual is that one of the mountains in Antarctica is named after this very unusual dry hole bird, D.H. Byrd, who, as I said, was his cousin. But we have him owning the Texas School Book Depository and raising money for LBJ, who's going to assume the presidency when Kennedy is killed. And it just so happens that D.H. Byrd owns the Texas School Book Depository where Kennedy is assassinated from. That's a lot of connections in a very small area of a plaza. If you've ever taken a look at Dealey Plaza, it's a very small contained area. So we're getting a little bit into, what's really going on here? So with that, we're starting to take a look at the fact that there's a connection with the UFO file with Admiral Byrd. There's D.H. Byrd owning the building and starting the Civil Air Patrol. And there's Oswald being trained at 15, because remember, he's kind of a semi-orphan, through the Civil Air Patrol, which becomes like a family to him. And who does he encounter when he's in this family? And that's going to lead us to Permindex. And it's a figure named David Ferrie. So David Ferrie is a mafia pilot and a CIA pilot. He's done a lot of drug running, delivering weapons to for Latin revolutionary against Latin revolutionary groups, and is a very unusual figure for a lot of different things, including his belief in the occult, his interest in voodoo and hypnotism, and studies in psychology, unusual psychology. I mean, he's a very strange figure, very interested in mind control. Now, there are people who were in his squadrons who said, he used to hypnotize me a lot for different things. So he has this very, very shady background and was a very unusual player. Well, the first thing that happened when Garrison heard about the assassination is he got a tip that Ferrie had gone to Dallas. And so as the DA of New Orleans, he tracked down Ferrie and had him in. And Ferrie answering the questions became really absurd, saying, I wanted to go ice skating and things like that. What he was genuinely there for, it seemed very interesting to Garrison, who knew he was an operator and a pilot. And he said, what's he doing over there? But he sent them to the FBI, and the FBI said, we're not going to do anything with him. Well, it turned out that when he reemerges a few years later, because Garrison's investigation hits the front pages, Garrison will actually subpoena him to testify. He's the first witness that he subpoenas, and Ferrie will end up dead before he can say anything. Now, for years, researchers brought forward the fact that Ferrie and Oswald were in the same unit, and all of the Warren Commission critics and all the Warren Commission admirers and all of the media and all these people were like, oh, that's ridiculous. No, he wasn't. It ain't true. And just forget that you heard it, basically. And it was over and over again. They'd send these guys out, like Gerald Posner. He had a whole book, and there's a big section on it, which is like, why Ferrie didn't know Oswald. So finally, it just so happened that somebody who was in the squadron was like, oh yeah, I remember Ferrie, controlled the squadron, and I was in it with Oswald. And everyone said, no, it's not true. A huge pushback again, but there he produced the picture, and there it is, which is right there. Now you see, can I have that pen, Olivia? Mm-hmm. Gracias, senorita. Right here we see Lee Harvey Oswald at 15 in the Civil Air Patrol, and he's in the squadron. That's David Ferrie, and it's been, expert after expert has proven, yeah, that's the two of them. And they've done close-ups and everything else. So that's just them. So yes, in fact, Ferrie was Oswald's commander. Now, Ferrie, with his connections to intelligence, is probably the liaison here, and that's how we get Oswald involved in this situation in the first place. Ferrie is going to be connected to someone named Clay Shaw, who is on the board of Permindex, this unusual company, and that's how this whole web is going to open up for Garrison, who thought he was investigating the JFK assassination, and comes face to face with this thing, which is half fascist group, half aerospace contractor. And so we get into some very unusual dynamics in the setup of the case. Already you've got the patsy being primed for this whole thing. But some of the unusual things that they do with Oswald is they send him to Japan, where he's on a very secret U-2 base, which you need a high clearance for. And that's a CIA unit that he's sent in with to Atsugi, Japan. And then he is sent to Russia under the guise of being a defector and I hate America and all that kind of thing. And originally they're very suspicious of him. Eventually they let him in because they want to see what's up. They figure, hey, maybe if we bug him, we'll figure it out.
Can I pop a question in?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, Space Ghost wanted to know, is Oswald an early MK Ultra?
Well, I think he is for a few reasons. One, he's incredibly well trained, as we can see by the time the police interrogate him. He's very tight with his answers, etc. But I think by the final day, he's starting to realize he's being set up as the patsy, and so his demeanor changes. But I think initially he's too cool a cucumber, which might have been the reason they picked him in the first place, that he could keep his head under pressure. There's so many interesting things that connect around UFOs and NASA with Oswald that there are a number of researchers. Garrison, when he was going into the background of Oswald in New Orleans, he went to Riley Coffee Company, where Oswald had worked in that summer before the assassination. And he went there, and the people who were there were saying, well, you know, he said he was getting a job at NASA. That's where they were shipping him out to. And then a lot of the people who were supposed to be close to him at this coffee place, they ship coffee, they have coffee, they make coffee, they do all these things. Those people would wind up in aerospace jobs, high security jobs. So they couldn't talk to Garrison. You got this block after block, and everywhere he was turning, he was running into NASA. And he's like, what's this? I expected to be running into maybe like low-level assassination people, the FBI, whatever. Over and over again, he's hitting into aerospace companies. This will bother him a lot. And the records that they keep back now, when you hear about these record releases, a lot of the records that they keep back are the Garrison records that the CIA, the kind of examinations they were doing, the surveillance they were doing on Garrison. So when we look at that, we can see that the CIA was extremely nervous during that period from 67 to 69 of the Garrison trial. Now, there's a very important figure who came forward and wrote The Cult of Intelligence, Victor Marchetti, and he was assistant to Richard Helms. And he said that during the trial and during the setup to the trial of Clay Shaw that Garrison put on trial for assassinating JFK, that Helms was nervous and was on the phone a lot, being like, how can we help Shaw? What can we do to get him the help that he needs to get Garrison off his back? And he would have meetings and roundtables and all this kind of stuff. Now, Marchetti put that on the record. It's undeniable. So the CIA had an incredible interest in this case. And then when Garrison asked Shaw point blank on the stand, are you part of the CIA? And he was evasive and said, if I were, would I be talking to someone like you and things like that? It turned out that in testimony, it was admitted that Richard Helms admitted that Clay Shaw was a CIA operative and had been in domestic contacts for years, since the 40s. So I should get into Shaw a little bit, but it'll give us some idea that Garrison was very ahead of his time with this, and that he was kind of like a renegade truther running into this incredible machine, this thing that was around aerospace and was, had this incredible power. And his final sort of thought on the situation was that the actual assassination plot rested inside the aerospace aspect of the military-industrial complex. That aspect is very important because it comes up right in the heart of the Permindex question. And Permindex is where Garrison really had his eyes opened about what was happening with this case. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is NASA, Nazis, JFK, and Permindex, the secret space program. We're going to find how these all come together, and we're going to open our eyes up to some history here and what does that hold for our own future, which is so space-dominated, and who's up there and who's setting up the global control grid. These are crucial questions. I want to remind everyone with all of the kind of crazy censorship that we've seen going on to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it'll keep you in the loop for the shows and the incredible interviews that we have coming up for you, which between now and the holidays are going to be quite remarkable. So you're going to want those. And but the way that it works with YouTube and stuff is they can basically, when they feel like it, they'll tell you there's a show coming up, and if they don't feel like it, they'll just shut it down. And we've seen an awful lot of people just being thrown off left and right when it comes to this. So the safest way to stay in touch is get on that newsletter list for sure. What you got there?
Someone just mentioned earlier that we now finally are over 80,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. And it's like, I think it's for the last year. They've been yanking
this is very
90%.
Yeah, we have, I mean, in truth, and who even cares about these numbers, but in truth, we have about 150 to 200,000 subscribers. And what they were doing all year is we get up to 79,999, and they float us all the way back to 73,000 subscribers, to 72,000 subscribers. We go back up there, you get 79,999, and woof. So this is an interesting process of an algorithm that's just there to kind of hold you back.
The most frustrating thing about it is that actual viewers don't get notified of shows.
Yes,
right?
well, they unsubscribe them so actively, and we get so many emails of people saying, I signed up and I signed up and I signed up again, you know? So it's a disturbing pattern in terms of what they're used to. But, you know, I think the program that they're working on the Google side is just to keep it down. You know, it's too obvious to just throw everybody off. But keeping it down is kind of easy for them. So that's what they're up to.
Now, you know so much about the Kennedy assassination. We could just do a free-for-all and just throw questions at you.
Oh, well, we have a very big presentation tonight.
I know.
Yes, go for it.
So, so anyway, I know you're probably not going to get into this tonight, but just let me throw it out. The Black Zionist wants to know, were there two Oswalds? And there's that whole book about that.
There is. I mean, there's definitely someone impersonating Oswald. Now, there's a much deeper examination of the two Oswalds, and it has to do with the fact that from a very early age that sets someone up to use his name and credentials. So that's why we have him in school in New York while he's in school in New Orleans. But I think that what's provable on the ground, you know, some people are like, there's Lee Harvey and Harvey Lee, and that they have this guy who was sort of a lookalike, and that they did this, and he spoke Russian a lot better than Oswald did. In fact, I think what's provable on the ground is that the CIA actively put out people who fit his description doing certain things. Like they would go certain places and act up and be like, this country's terrible, communism is better, to paint him as a communist later. There are the pictures that came back from the Mexico City embassy of this guy showing up. And those pictures are funny. They're in Agent Oswald. Actually, all this is in the documentary I did, Agent Oswald. And I highly recommend it because it shows that what they were doing was building a pattern. And it was a little easier back then to do it. Remember the photos of him with the rifle? And he's like, he has a rifle, a pistol, and a communist magazine. And nowadays, we'd be like, oh, it's Photoshop, you know? But back then, they had sort of the magic powers, and they could alter a photograph and be like, see? So Oswald, if you really look at that, layers and layers of kind of mind control, misinformation on top, they had to make everyone believe that he was this, you know, crazy lone nut who got off a lucky shot, and oh, isn't it terrible? Little old Oswald killed big old Kennedy, but we all have to get used to it and move on. And like Johnson takes over the military-industrial complex and bombs the hell out of everybody, right? So I think that you know, a more accurate reading of the 60s goes something like this. Kennedy came in, he wasn't beholden to these forces like the Dulles forces. You know, John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State. Allen Dulles had been a Wall Street lawyer at S&C, which is the big Sullivan Cromwell, the hub of the government. And they thought that they were running the world. They were doing things like overthrowing Iran so we could get the oil. And, you know, in Guatemala with Arbenz, they just threw him out. So they were running the show. And so by the time Kennedy got in there, he saw that the CIA was running a completely unconstitutional game, and that they were going to get us into really negative situations, especially nuclear situations. So what he did was he put in place a number of safeguards to pull back their power. But first, when he first got in there, remember, he was inaugurated in January. In April is the Bay of Pigs operation, where the CIA set up an invasion of Cuba using Cuban exiles and things like that. That whole operation was a leftover from Eisenhower and Nixon. They didn't pull it off because they thought they couldn't pull it off. And so the CIA basically tried to get cozy up to Kennedy and be like, we've got this. We were just about to do this before you got in, and, let's do it. And Kennedy was naive enough at the beginning to get sucker punched with the Bay of Pigs, but he did not send in any military to back up those exiles. And so the CIA plan set up all these dynamics where we didn't get Cuba back, et cetera, because when Castro had taken over the island of Cuba, remember Cuba in the hot zone, there's more going on here than just the history as it's recounted. However, these aspects are important. Castro originally takes over from Batista, and Batista gets run out, but he's running all the casinos and he's running all the drugs and everything else for the mafia down there. So there is this whole kind of criminal aspect that he's cutting off. But I think more importantly, there's a larger picture of what happens in the hot zone. So when Castro gets in there, it upsets all that geopolitical situation. But I do feel that it's very important to understand it this way, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis and things of this nature, and this Soviet support for Castro and all the rest, they are power plays. But you have to wonder also what the deeper story is, given the background that we have on these shows dealing with the hot zone, and how there were groups there that were exploring what was underwater. So there was a great attention to detail underwater. I've put forward the aspects that they were looking at ruins that were underwater. But whatever it is, there's an extra element to all of these things that involve this kind of chess game that was going on. But in any case, the CIA wanted to go in there full guns and take over. And what happened was that Kennedy, by denying them that and then trying to defang them and get them back under presidential authority. Because remember, I think it's important to understand about the CIA, because we hear a lot about them now. And there's a lot of people in the UFO community who are trying to cozy up to the CIA, who are like, they're the only ones who can get us the answers. The CIA is, the nature of the organization is to lie. That's what they've done since they were set up. It's an extra constitutional setup. They're not envisioned in the Constitution at all. And there were groups like the OSS before the CIA. And when they came to Truman, when he became president, kind of prematurely, vice president for a couple of months, and they shove him in there as president, and they say to him, look, you have to set up the CIA. And he says, well, that sounds like a Gestapo. Like, America doesn't do Gestapo. This is him originally, how he was parsing it out. And eventually he goes along with it and signs the National Security Act in 1947. That opens up this huge corridor where these people can do things illegally without being prosecuted for it. And that's where you get all these scurrilous forces, a lot of them from Wall Street. Remember, not even military people. Allen Dulles is a Wall Street lawyer. And so, you're getting the representation of this kind of corporate set when you're getting the CIA. We have to keep that in mind. The other thing is that they start going way beyond their mandate right away. And there's a group that's inside of them called the Office of Policy Coordination. And they go over and they're doing things like overthrowing elections and blowing up trains and things like that. And Truman's like, I don't know who these people are. Like, get whatever is going on, get it under control. So they are this wing of covert action operators. And there's an incredible story about that. I mean, it's not central to this story, but Frank Wisner and his incredible exploits running this OPC and how the CIA tries to get this thing back under control. And the way that people who view this history look at it, like Peter Dale Scott, who studied this for 5 decades, UC Berkeley professor, he says that basically OPC took over the CIA. It worked the other way, and that this illegal group just kind of, when they tried to get into the CIA, absorbed it. It went the other way around, and that their criminal activities just kept getting bigger and bigger. So when you get to Kennedy, it's like a straight up battle, and it ends with the Kennedy assassination, and the forces that are used are intel CIA related. So, this group Permindex, we're going to find out, is a creation of the CIA. And so all these figures who come out of it, when we look at it, we're going to find ourselves in the midst of banking, corporate, family money. These are the forces that we're talking about who are playing this out. So when Kennedy comes in looking at freedom and looking to tamp down the Cold War tensions, looking to get out of things like Laos, looking not to get into things like Vietnam, and not invade Cuba and things like that, these people are losing all the munitions money. They're losing all the control. In one of the reports, they'd already had named different parts of Cuba, buildings they were going to put up there. So you're losing all that potential for money. And when Kennedy is thinking, well, I'm moving the country and the world forward towards peace, and he sets up, the first test ban treaty on nuclear weapons. Well, that gets rid of an entire industry of developing nuclear weapons. So he's really causing a lot of problems for established forces, and those forces are hell-bent on a kind of control. Now, when you look at the CIA and how they have this kind of chemical makeup of dominance, look, we had the OSS, but when we took over Germany, they had someone there. You can find a lot of this material in be like Professor or Dr. Joseph Farrell and May Brussels' work, that they had an intelligence head in Nazi Germany named General Galen, in that they decided to basically adopt Galen intelligence gathering methods and leave him at the helm of what he was doing. Even though we had beaten Nazi Germany, he could give us all of that intel because they were fighting against the Russia at the time. So we have a really dyed-in-the-wool Nazi Gestapo spy chief setting us up, giving us the intel for how to set up the CIA. This is the problem in the first place. So, now, don't get me wrong, like Russia and other countries, they're no saints either, and they absorb their own piece of this Nazi influence as well. And people, when we look at China and stuff, they're no saints. I mean, we see they work the people in the factory so hard that they jump out the window. And what's their solution is, they let Apple put nets, so when people jump out the window, they don't die. They can get them back, and they don't get them the help they need. They just get them back there to work. So, none of these countries have great solutions, but we're talking specifically about the Central Intelligence Agency here and the work that they've done to destabilize democracies around the planet. So we have to remember always with the CIA, one, it's not constitutional. Two, it's been sanctioned over and over again, and they tried to get control over this thing in the 70s in the church committees, getting into how the fact that they created the MK Ultra programs in the first place, and in the 80s when they were doing all the things with the Contras and all the rest of it, and we see a lot of things around 9/11. Again, the CIA becoming a part of our everyday life when they're supposed to be a non-domestic agency. They're supposed to be an agency that looks around the world at dangers and gives that kind of intelligence back to the president so he can make decisions. Instead, with this CIA, you've got groups that are, basically they try to decide who's going to be president. And that's where you got the whole Russian scandal and all the rest of it. It's another deep state action against the presidency. It doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. If he's not doing what they want, then they want to get him out of there. And, they don't have the power. This isn't a banana republic, but they're making it one. So one of the things that happens when Kennedy is assassinated is they put Allen Dulles in charge of the Warren Commission, and Dulles was the CIA director that Kennedy fired. And the first thing that he says in conference, what he thinks is confidential conference, is he says, we have to make sure that people believe in this story because they can't believe that America's a banana republic. And the whole thing about banana republics is, as soon as one of the guys doesn't go along with the CIA, they would blow him away and install the next guy. So, so all the things are there, all the facets are there with the CIA to operate lawlessly, and we're dealing with them on a regular basis now, which is why it's so important when we get around things like the UFO file and you see people and, these companies coming out and saying, hey, we have all this money and all these CIA people like TTSA and all that. We have a fundamental duty not to work with groups who have this kind of a history, who have not reform. There's been no reform in the CIA. And if anything, they seek always to go beyond their mandate. They've got a big influence in Hollywood, a huge influence on the media. They can make or break careers in the media. This is the kind of thing, it requires, in the alternative, a real pushback. And the first rule is you don't work with the CIA, in my opinion. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. This is episode 73, NASA, Nazis, JFK, and Permindex, the secret space program. We're going to get into those secret space program aspects now. But before I do, Miss Olivia, how are we doing?
Good. Liberty Thunder wanted to know, do you see a potential disbanding of the CIA once again, but this time under Trump? What is the CIA's relationship to Trump?
Well, they've tried to remove him.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried before he got in to remove him with something called the Steele dossier, which turned out to be completely a lie, just something a British intelligence agency made up. So, the problem is with Trump, the way that the CIA is looking at him is he's unpredictable. And so they're not sure when they're going in a certain direction if they can get the kind of assistance they need from him. They wanted to bomb Syria, for example. So they're looking at him and thinking, oh, we can't, it's hard. We're not going to be able to control this guy. And he also has his own money, his own influence, and all the rest of it. Whatever you think of Trump, the idea of some weird agency who's been kind of a plague in American politics for 7 decades, being able to call the shots on an election or overturn it is absurd. And so the CIA needs reform. It needs to be put into its original. Look, Harry Truman, who created it, okay, he was afraid of an American Gestapo. That's one. Two, a month after Kennedy was assassinated, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, which said, kind of like, mend it or end it, basically. And, that if you can't reform this organization, if it can't be put into its original mandate, you're going to have to scrap it. And he was very concerned about it. And, as soon as he wrote that op-ed, the CIA director went down there and visited him and said, you have to retract this. And he said, no, I'm old. You can't do anything to me. It doesn't matter. You can't threaten me. I already know your games. I created you. I created you, Frankenstein. And so later, Dulles, who went down there to visit him to change his mind, he wrote something saying, oh, his mind is failing, or he just called you out. So it's one of the two. No, but when we get into it, when we really see what was happening there, we have to understand the Civil War of the 60s. There are all these forces coming in, and you see these kind of liberal guys talking on these PBS programs, and they're like, the incredible things that we went through, and we achieved all these things in the 60s. Like, it's true on one hand, but a lot of things were really taken away. And so that you lost a lot of things. So yeah, you got to march in like the Civil Rights March. That was one thing that moved society forward. But there were so many things that, when looking back on that, is where America really loses its way, because the assassinations go by unchallenged. And they'll have more, they'll have more aspects of this, because it's basically, that was the Civil War. They talk about it now. It took place there, and one side clearly lost. The CIA won.
There was tremendous experimentation in that decade, but it was a net loss, with all the wounding. Everybody came out of it damaged.
Yeah.
Basically. And, for the first half of the 70s, basically, and then started to recoup some energy with disco, right? But it was all hedonism. And, it's not like they...
So disco was the answer.
Yeah, disco. Well, they started to celebrate life again, but it's like, you see old pictures of the early... people were damaged from the 60s, psychologically, emotionally, physically, from the drugs, from the trauma, from the riots, It was an intense decade.
There's no question. There's no question about that. And likening it to a war, I think, is correct. The only problem is, I think what they do in these PBS specials is they try to kind of make this certain aspect of America, kind of like white liberal America, feel good, that everything turned out great when it didn't. And the problem was the fundamental, they're like, hey, we got Nixon out of there. without realizing that it's actually the CIA who removed Nixon because he wasn't worth anything to them anymore. And in fact, he was starting to, he was resisting them and actually going around their backs and getting the records and things like that. So we have to be careful. What happens is you get a lot of this derangement now too when you talk to people who don't like Trump. And you can feel anyway, this is not a show that's going to put forward a political agenda. It's front and center, I'll express support for this or that. But one of the things I want to say is that it doesn't matter if you appreciate Trump or not. You cannot let this clandestine force choose. You have a voting system. That's what we have. So you can't let some weird agency, which isn't even part of the Constitution, control who's in there. And you hear these people, the New York Times did a story. This is really funny. When they said, well, there is a deep state and thank God for it because they're the only ones who can take Trump out, and thank God they're preserving our liberties. And so they're willing to say, yeah, there is a deep state, but don't worry, they're there to get rid of Trump. They're your friends, So it's really weird. The messages across cultural lines, I think, have broken down, and we're looking at all sorts of bizarre behavior. So when we track this back, when we're looking back at this force that came in, and that one little investigator back there, Jim Garrison, ran into and really took it on, he face to face. He was face to face with something. It was a very dangerous thing he was doing. And I don't think when he originally went into it, he realized he was going to be up against all this. We can take the fruits of his investigation and apply them, especially with some of the new knowledge that I'm going to bring forward tonight about a case going on in Canada about this Louis Bloomfield's records, the man who ran Permindex. This is going to be a very important segment. Everyone, you're watching Dark Journalist Show X-73, NASA Nazis, JFK, Permindex, and the Secret Space Program. It's fantastic. It's a huge crowd tonight, and we're coming up on the 56th anniversary of the JFK assassination. It's remarkable, right? You'd look at it and you'd think society would be further along looking at this question and just have those answers. But 56 years later, it's more buried than ever in some ways.
It's the media. It's the mainstream media.
There's no question. Well, the Kennedy death, the Kennedy murder is one of the central kind of core things that discredits the media and the CIA, and that's why it can't be allowed. A number of years ago, they had these specials that were done by Peter Jennings, and he did one on the JFK assassination and one on UFOs. And he left the door open on UFOs. So it was kind of like, hey, UFOs could be real, whatever. But the JFK thing was like, nope, it was Oswald. That's it. Everyone else is a crazy conspiracy theorist. How dangerous that is for this country. I think I said conspiracy therapist. Maybe that's my new role, conspiracy therapist. But I think it's interesting to note that in those big specials that they put a lot of time and effort in, the Kennedy assassination was the big untouchable, still, the real conclusion. And the UFO thing was allowed, just like the TTSA stuff, the media will pick up on it and like, hey, we want to talk about UFOs, and like, oh, it's a threat and all the rest. But you don't see them still 56 years later. They won't really take on the Kennedy thing, not in earnest. They'll talk about little side show things like, oh, there's a Cuban agent or a mafia guy, but it has nothing to do with the hardcore story, of which there is incredible, and I mean incredible, detail from good researchers. So this gets me to a fundamental tenet of dark journalism, and I'll sum it up really quickly. Dark journalism works like this. There's an official story, and that is what's being put out by the government, very often to protect the government. Then there's a secondary story, often called the conspiracy theory, where a number of writers, professors, researchers, analysts realize there's something wrong with that official story and start to question it and put forward theories as to why they're hiding certain things and good details. You find great people in that milieu, like Professor Scott. Underneath that is junk conspiracy. Junk conspiracy is that kind of runaway thing, it'll be like, oh, the driver shot JFK or something like that. They'll throw some wild thing in there. And So, no one died at 9/11 or something like that. Some real far out thing. Now, what's strange is that is meant to drive an ordinary person back to the official story, because they're trying to lump in the secondary researchers who are questioning the official story with the junk conspiracy, flat earth, things like that. You hear that one a lot. So, people question things like secret space program. Is there a secondary space program? Incredibly legit thing to question. You throw in flat earth and, it seems like, oh, just throw all those people who are talking about crazy things in that basket. Oh, it's a reptilian, right? So it gets into this whole flavor of a thing that's meant to drive people back. Now, very often the people who are putting out the junk conspiracy are coming from that top level. Remember the cabal arrests, right? So cabal arrests, and we're going to have Hillary and Soros on a barge heading to Cuba to go to Gitmo. They played that one out for a couple of years straight, pretty much. Cabal arrests, I found a 2011 Ben Fulford disinformation thing about it. It's like cabal arrests coming any minute. And so this is what they've sold to people. It's that kind of hope porn that we talk about. We see a lot of groups and a lot of cults out there doing this. And you have to wonder who's actually putting that stuff out. And because the idea that you should be happy and everything's under the control of white hats, whatever that means, it's a joke, because we've seen just the opposite. The way things get done is when citizens stand up for it.
And unfortunately, we need to make serious sacrifices for that.
Yeah, no question about it. So yeah, it does reflect very deeply on, I think, what we have going on now. But it's interesting too how many forces are engaged in this right now. We're looking at things like that. On the other side, we have intense left-wing, like Antifa and all these other things. So it's a lot of disinformation and a lot of kind of switching sides and a lot of sort of craziness, accusation. There's no way to get a consensus, right? And I think that's part of what they're trying to do. Anyone who is looking deeply into it is going to find out that, you're dealing with junk conspiracy and you're dealing with legitimate questioning of the official story. You have to be able to filter those two. You have to be able to separate out, okay, that's the official story, 2008 crash, right? It was just a couple of bad actors, and they were selling stuff that poor people couldn't afford, and they raised the premiums or whatever. No, it was a $40 trillion grab, and, Obama signed it away. I mean, that's what happened there. So, we have to be able to spot these things and really kind of move into a new way of looking at it.
So I think we're getting off.
No, it's good. It's good, actually.
Right.
It's all the actual function of the thing is that the deep state has grown up, and the snapshot that we're in was the crucial place where they really took over. And I think that's the nature of the thrust of it. But you are watching Dark Journalist, everyone. It is great to have you here on this, leading up to the 56th anniversary of the JFK assassination. Now, the secret space program. This is very interesting. Of course, as you know, I've done a number of shows on the secret space program and done work with people like Catherine Austin Fitz and Dr. Joseph Farrell. And we did some conferences there in 2014, 2015, and the 2015 conference in Austin is really kind of the benchmark, I think, for those shows. And so what happened, I think what was coming together around this, the idea fundamentally of a secret space program works something like this. Did you have a question? Okay. What is it you got there?
I'm deeply serious about the chat.
That's very Olivia when she starts going into it. So the secret space program is something that came up, really, the thrust of it came through someone who was a NASA hacker. And Gary McKinnon told us that when he hacked into some computers at NASA, and he was a British hacker, that he saw an off-world officers list. So he saw the listing of crews for who would go off world. And so the thrust of the secret space program comes predominantly from those revelations from the early 2000s. There have been other references to it, of course, but that really was the benchmark for it. Now, that was no small case because when Obama went over to the UK, he was there with James Cameron. They were at a press conference, and they brought up the case of Gary McKinnon, and he had to really wiggle his way out of that. So the idea is simple. There's technology, there's military groups, there's off-world officers that we have that have been exploring space and are part of a program that's not talked about, even though the public pays for NASA. And as part of that secret space program, they're further ahead. In other words, we haven't been back to the moon since 1972. So, it was President Kennedy who gave us the big drive to go to the moon in the first place. We choose to go to the moon was this incredible speech before the end of the decade. And they made it. And, we have the Apollo missions, and we have Nixon being the president who presided over this. So that happens in July 1969. They do some more trips to the moon. And then suddenly in 1972, it stops. So now, almost 50 years later, they're talking about going back to the moon and pretending like it's the first time we've ever heard of space or the moon or anything else. So what happened to those 50 years in between? Well, there's a lot of threads that show there was a secret program that kept on going that the public didn't hear about. And these are the things that we've been trying to get into. Also, this gets us into question the UFO file question, which is what are they encountering when they go out there? Now, we hear all about probes, and this is a totally different kind of thing. Yes, we send probes to Mars, we send them into deep space. We're talking about manned missions, like manned missions to the moon. So there's all sorts of unusual things about the actual trips to the moon anyway. A lot of anomalies, shall we say. And but given the situation as it is, they stopped in 72. So what was it that was happening in the interim there? Well, in the files that were released, there were some files released recently that got us into a program called Blue Gemini, which I did a show on, and you can check that one out in the X series, the Blue Gemini shows. And what happened is that Kennedy realized that there were groups inside NASA that were coordinating with Wernher von Braun, who was the father of our space program and also an ardent Nazi, but a reformed Nazi that we got of Germany, and whose unit surrendered to Clay Shaw, who's going to come up a little bit later here. Now, von Braun really takes us into the territory of the space program and that the Nazis had, because they had an entire rocket program far, far, far before we did. And they were using it in the V-2 rockets to bomb London and all the rest. So the Nazi aspect of this is crucial, because one of the things that Dr. Farrell stresses in his research is that it was, in fact, von Braun who insisted on having these other Nazis come with him into the space program in order to accomplish these great things. And so they took really hardened Nazis, one of them who was set to be killed for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg, and Walter Dornberger. Now, Dornberger is very interesting because he plays right into the Kennedy case, because strangely enough, our friend Lee Harvey Oswald, when he lands back in Texas, he and his wife are staying with Ruth and Michael Payne. And it's a very unusual couple, but Michael Payne's an engineer for Bell Helicopter, and his boss and his mentor is Walter Dornberger, who's the Nazi who was in charge of Wernher von Braun. So we have these instant Nazi connections around the JFK assassination everywhere you look, just like the NASA part with when we're looking at Oswald's history. So when we see this now and we're looking at von Braun and this whole kind of, where is this going? We start to take a look at what was happening. So one of the things that Kennedy had seen was that in this Blue Gemini setup, NASA and this group were doing their own tests And he was like, well, I didn't order that test. What's going on? Where did that even come from? Where did the money for it come from? Who gave the okay for it, etc.? So he's going through this, and he sends over Robert McNamara to NASA to kind of confront this contingent who's creating their own rules and doing their own tests. And in fact, the document that came out now is from 2015, and the document shows that McNamara says, apparently we have 2 space programs going on. And so for the first time, Kennedy takes a program away from NASA called Blue Gemini, and he says, I'm going to give it to the military. It's like the devil that I know, basically. What's going on at NASA? Like, we have to get a handle on that. Who are these people? That is the first admission, in my opinion, in writing of a secret space program. And it's crucial that it happens on record, because it's McNamara who suggests there are 2 space programs. And the idea is that they don't need to parallel each other. We just have one space program and get it over with. So he sends this Blue Gemini program back to the military. This tussle over Blue Gemini becomes something, when we look into it, that gets us into the X technology, because that's what's in play here when we have these Nazis who are working. Now, they're post-Nazis. That is, the war ended in 1945, and we inherited a certain amount of those scientists. So we're in these kind of space races with the Russians at the time, and we're incorporating these Nazis into this program. So what happens is, before the assassination, as I brought up in my interview with Linda Moulton Howe last week, that the UFO file becomes a big football in the middle of this. And Kennedy asks, as part of this program that he wants to move forward with the Russians in doing this joint space force, he asks the CIA to give him the UFO file, basically. And it's this weird kind of tense thing where he says, as part of my new program, boom. Then he goes to NASA and asks James Webb, says, this is a very important memo. It's National Security Action Memo number 271, where he says, you have to now go forward and give us this new kind of cooperation in outer space with the Russians. Here's my new program. Now, this group that's deep inside NASA, which is from the Nazi, Dornberger and von Braun, and this entire setup of Nazis that were part of the original program, they're very shaken up by this, because Kennedy, in going after the UFO file and going after the CIA, is going after where they live, basically, and where those connections are that they have. And so this fascist aspect gets awakened to remove Kennedy. And this is where the evidence leads us, inevitably. So that's how we can kind of think of the secret space program. Now let's take a look again when we're talking about Garrison. What does he find? Well, he encounters this Permindex group, and he's very puzzled by what's going on here, because the person that he is accused of being complicit in the JFK assassination is someone named Clay Shaw, who is the director. Now, both he and Blumenthal are directors of Permindex. So this is very interesting, because he does all this work with World Trade Centers in New Orleans. And Clay Shaw is a very unusual figure. He's kind of a shadowy, clandestine figure who's predominantly used through business channels to go around the world and kind of keep these connecting threads. But there are all these kind of fascist connections and CIA connections around Shaw. And as I stated earlier, it was the CIA director who, according to Victor Marchetti, who was his assistant, was sweating bullets when this guy was under investigation by Garrison. So his connection eventually came out a decade later, and when Helms, the CIA director, under oath, said he was a CIA asset. So that showed that Garrison was right, but it was 10 years after the trial that Garrison had lost in trying to put this guy away. But what Garrison was able to do was able to put on the record that there was a factor inside of the JFK assassination not accounted for either in the official story or in most of the theories that had grown up around it. And the factor was this very unusual group called Permindex. Now, I'm going to read a little bit about Permindex. This is Louis Bloomfield meeting the Prime Minister of Israel. Bloomfield is the director. He's the top man for Permindex. And he's somebody who would have Shaw on his board. Now, it's pretty interesting when we get down into it because Bloomfield has very, very unusual connections and decidedly X-series style connections, and that there's a big UFO, well, I wouldn't say UFO, it's more like an esoteric connection with him. A couple of quick things about him. Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, and by the way, he is at the center now. He's been dead for a number of years, but his records are at the center of a legal battle that's still going on, trying to get this out, and a lot of it has to center on his correspondence with President Bush, the first, George H.W. Bush, the Rothschilds, and other political figures. And so apparently there's something in there that was damaging that was not deleted when he originally died and thought he was donating his papers. So there's been a huge battle going on over this. They were supposed to come out in 2004, as I suggested, and this is absolutely explosive if we can get our hands on those records. So get just a little bit about him. He's a Canadian lawyer from Montreal. Again, Louis Bloomfield. Anyone who watches this show is familiar with the name Bloomfield because of Bloomfield Moor and some of the explorations. And when we track names in this show, this one comes up a lot. He died in 1984, and he had worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. He had set up Permindex, and he was also part of OSS, which was the original setup for it. He was a Zionist, and he was one of the early people in promoting the State of Israel. Now, he was born in Quebec, and he married Justine Adelaide Stern Cartier. Now, she is the one who would block his records from coming out, and it's very interesting when we get into her as well. Now, I'm going to skip over some of the stuff of his past round. I mean, he basically went to McGill University, Master of Law, and the guy had incredible connections. It seems like anywhere he went, banking, law, corporations, he was just able to walk in and roll the roost. It's very interesting. So one of the books that he wrote was the British Honduras-Guatemala dispute, which instantly identifies him with that whole hot zone area, which I think is an important thing to note as we get into his background. His background, I couldn't even, it would probably take me the rest of the show to read you his credits, because this guy is on the board of so many different organizations. He's a council member of the American Society of International Law. He served on the Mixed Court of Tangier Tribunal, but he was the executor of something called Lady Davis's Estate. That's going to become very important before we're done here. Lady Davis's Estate. He served in World War II at the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps as the rank of major. And as I said, in 1947, he became a CIA operative. He served as president of Heineken Breweries in Canada. This guy, again, all over the place. Like we've seen this before with people like Sanche de Gramont and others. They show up and they can just kind of pop into any particular thing. Morris Jessup was a little bit like this also. He was also named as a major leader of the Swiss company Permindex, a company alleged to be a front organization for the CIA. It is a front organization for the CIA. So he was a pillar of the community for a number of Montreal charities. He's the president of the Quebec Council. One of these days we're going to do just an overview of what works through charities, because that's going to give us a better idea. So he was a member of the Board of Governors of the America-Israel Cultural Foundation, and he is on the board of something called Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. Now, this is very important. Israel Institute of Technology is thought of as the best school in all of Israel. And the kind of influence of this group is phenomenal in terms of what they're working on. But space is a big piece of it. It's like MIT close by to here. The space aspect is huge. Now, Israel's been getting more and more into space. They sent their first probe up to the moon recently, and this is part of this move. But we're going to note the space connection because Permindex and space are going to go really hand in glove as we get along here. And we're going to be talking about a group called DISC, which comes from something called the Torbitt Document. Now, he's an honorary citizen of Tel Aviv and visited there every year. So this is incredible Israel connection. Now, here's the rub. Permindex on its board has basically like a fascist who's who. So this Jewish lawyer being at the head of it's very unusual. So it's going to, there's a little bit of head spinning that's going to go on as we get along here. He is also someone who came up with, as I said, he was somebody who was basically the executor of the Lady Davis estate. They took Lady Davis's money and basically created this MIT-style institute in Israel. And the idea was to make them very kind of technologically advanced. And he set up something which was called the Lady Davis Professional Chair of Experimental Physics. So showing you where that Permindex focus was going, experimental physics in aerospace. Keep that in mind as we go along. He died in 1984. Now, prior to his death, Bloomfield donated to the Library and Archives of Canada 31 boxes of documents related to some of his notable clients and charity work, as well as correspondence with prominent politicians, including United States President George H.W. Bush. The fact that Clay Shaw, who was grabbed by Garrison as the connecting link in the JFK assassination and put on trial, was also a top member of this organization, and that this person, Bloomfield, is working hand in glove. And there are these letters with George H.W. Bush is very concerning because Bush is not only vice president and president, but he was also CIA director. Now, when he was donating the documents, it came with the condition that the documents would not be made public until 20 years after his death. Okay, he died in 84, so in 2004, everything should have been hunky-dory. And one of the things that we've brought up on this program on a number of occasions is something called stealth archives. Now, stealth archives exist all over these different situations, and they exist for the reason of being able, they could exist for blackmail purposes, but they also exist for the reason of being able to cash in and claim credit after the fact. So, for example, with the UFO file, we find out that LBJ has an X letter at his library. And everyone says, oh, that's related to some political thing. They'll let that out in 2023. And there's always a partial release thing with these two. It's like, well, we've seen one little bit of it, so therefore it's no big deal. So they try to kind of let some of the air out of the balloon. We've seen with the Rockefeller archives, there were 4 archives for a study they did in the 50s, and they left 4 of them out, even though they put out these ones on race, and the economy, and everything else. So it's always the thing that they're leaving out that is crucial. The time capsule work that we've done with the Nixon time capsule and Robert Merritt, again, the X time capsule, these are archives which we can't get our hands on, but we know that they're there. In the case of the LBJ library, the letter is there and to be opened in 2023. So in this case, it was to be opened in 2004. So what happened? Where were those letters of Bloomfield writing with George H.W. Bush? I do, in fact, have some letters I'm going to read tonight that Bloomfield put on the record. Now, there's a guy up there in Canada named Maurice Phillips. It's interesting when we think about things that go on down here. Things that are in Canada sometimes don't make it down here. They get censored out, and it's crazy because we could really use those fresh ideas and things because they're very, very tuned in to Permindex in Canada because it's there. A JFK assassination author requested access to the Bloomfield collection, but was told that Bloomfield's widow had extended the restriction on accessing the documents until 25 years after her death. Phillips challenged the decision, and a 2006 federal court ruling found that the Library and Archives of Canada could not extend the restriction to access the documents past the original deadline set by Bloomfield himself. Now, this is an interesting thing that Bloomfield felt after 20 years it was going to be okay for people to access whatever was in there. being that he is somebody who participated in things that Permindex was into, I mean, all the way back to trying to overthrow Charles de Gaulle in France, it's interesting to me that he would leave anything, but he did. And again, this concept of a stealth archive, which is we have this information out there, maybe it is some kind of a chess piece very often that they can use or cash in. This is something to keep in mind, I think, as we get along here. So in any case, the author challenged the decision and the library was told they had to turn him over, but they didn't. According to Bloomfield's nephew, Harry Bloomfield, the restriction to access was unnecessary. Philip stated that he believed the documents in the collection wouldn't implicate his uncle, and he wanted them to come out, but they never did. Now, this case has gone heavily back and forth, and I've been getting more and more information about it. I do think it's important for us to list a couple of people involved with Permindex. One of them was the fascist exiled Prime Minister of Hungary, which is Ferenc Nagy, and he's somebody who's meeting here with Harry Truman in this shot. And Nagy is important because he is someone who, you know, after being sort of this exiled fascist figure and setting up all this business, where does it that he goes after doing all this? Well, he lands in Dallas, and he's living in Dallas there in the late 50s and early 60s. And who rolls into Dallas but President Kennedy and gets assassinated there? It's an interesting place for a Hungarian to, a former exiled Hungarian prime minister, to show up. So we've taken a real good look at some of these things in the Bloomfield archives. This one, I think, is important because it's a letter that he wrote, and they don't say who he wrote it to. They black that out. But it says, when this gentleman calls you, you would invite him for a meal or a tea at your home in Cuernavaca. He has been one of my dearest and most loyal friends and has always gone out of his way to help me when I was a young lawyer. This is Bloomfield writing a letter to a friend. This is something that did come out of those archives. I brought him to Canada on August 8th, 1940, and it was through him that I met and acted for the various members of the Rothschild family who are still my friend and clients. So the Rothschild family he was connected with as early as 1940, before he was even in the CIA, and they're friends and clients of this guy and was running Permindex. Yes, what do you got?
Okay, they're just correcting your pronunciation.
Oh, yes.
So one person says that it's Naj, and another one says it's Naji. So not Nagy.
Oh, the Hungarian?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. There's a number of ways I've heard it pronounced.
So you've Americanized it,
I think
which is
so.
your right.
I think it's pretty easy, but the spelling is N-A-G-Y. But Trek, also Trek closely. I'm going to read this again now. When this gentleman calls you, you would invite him for a meal or tea at your home in Cuernavaca. He has been one of my dearest and most loyal friends and has always gone out of his way to help me when I was a young lawyer. I brought him to Canada on August 8th of 1940, and it was through him that I met and acted for the various members of the Rothschild family who are still my friends and clients. Okay, so this is an important understanding that Permindex, the man who leads it, is friends with the Rothschilds, and they're his clients as a lawyer, because remember, he works for a law firm there. Now, Permindex becomes an interesting stumbling block because there's so many different aspects to it, and how do we get a good handle on it? This is what Garrison had to say when he encountered it. So I'm going to read it directly out of his book, which is On the Trail of the Assassins, which is his own basic look at what happened at the assassination and all the unusual things he experienced, including when he was threatened to stop and all the rest. So this is what he has to say about, I'm going to keep calling him Nagy. Nagy is okay, but so Now, it's interesting. He's going through the different directors, and he's finding out that the directors of this organization, Permindex, and its sister organization, Centro, Mondiale, Commerciale, on whose board of directors Clay Shaw served, judging from the background of its members, the fairly heavy activities in which they were engaged, the organization could not be confused with the Shriners. The Centro was described in 1969 by writer Paris Flamand of The Kennedy Conspiracy, which is an excellent book, as apparently representative of the paramilitary right in Europe, including Italian fascists, the American CIA, and similar interests. He described it as a shell of superficiality composed of channels through which money flowed back and forth, with no one knowing the sources or destination of these liquid assets. In fact, Italy would throw them out. The Italian government had no problem distinguishing the organization. Before 1962 was out, it had expelled Centro, Mondiale, Commerciale, and its half-brother Permindex from Italy for subversive intelligence activities. And instantly we get a snapshot of what this group is about, Permindex. And they're thrown out. They're like, hey, we're not going to have them just sit there and spy on us. So subversive intelligence activities, that's crucial for us to keep in mind. Perhaps because of its Montreal origin, the Centro aroused the interest of Canadian newspaper Le Devoir. Referring to Nagy, one of the Centro's directors, it wrote in early 1967, Nagy maintains close ties with the CIA, which link him with the Miami Cuban colony. Nagy subsequently emigrated to the United States, making himself at home in Dallas, Texas. With regard to Major Bloomfield, we met earlier, who's the director of Permindex, the article observed that although now ostensibly a Canadian, he'd been involved in espionage in earlier years for the United States government. It went on to point out that Bloomfield was not only a major shareholder of the Centro, but also its affiliated group, Permindex, as well. Summing up the fate of the two related enterprises, the article stated, whatever the case may be, the Centro, Commerciale, and Permindex got into difficulties with the Italian and Swiss governments, which is where its headquarters was. They refused to testify to origins of considerable amounts of money, and they never seemed to engage in actual commercial transactions. The companies were expelled from Switzerland and Italy in 1962, and then set up headquarters in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Ugh.
So we could see, these countries were looking at them, and they were seeing them for what they were, and they were bouncing them, saying, get out of here, and this is the kind of, unfortunately, Montreal didn't do the same thing. The ultimate evaluation of Clay Shaw's Centro Mondiale Commerciale by the Paese Sera, which was an Italian newspaper, stated among its possible involvements, supported by the presence in directive posts of men deeply committed to organizations of the extreme right. The center was the creature of the CIA, set up as a power cover for the transfer of CIA funds in Italy for illegal political espionage activities. It still remains to clear up the presence of the administrative board of the center, Clay Shaw, and ex-major of the CIA, Bloomfield. The article made an additional observation about Centro. The newspaper observed that it was the point of contact for a number of persons who in certain respects have somewhat equivocal ties, whose common denominator is anti-communism so strong that it would swallow up all those in the world who have fought for decent relationships between East and West, including Kennedy. That just happened as well to be a trenchant one-line description of the parent organization, the Central Intelligence Agency. As for the Permindex, Clay Shaw also served as director. The Italian press revealed that it had, among other things, secretly financed the opposition of the French OAS, and this is a group that tried to take de Gaulle out. So what we can get from Garrison going and finding this out about Permindex is he realized when he grabbed Shaw that he was now grabbing this whole fascist organization that had an aerospace connection, and was laundering money and overthrowing elections and doing all these things with CIA support, and countries were booting them out. So now he's holding on to this suspect who he's going to charge in the JFK assassination. But where did he get Clay Shaw from in the first place? And this is something I think that is very important. Shaw, it turns out, had been in New Orleans and had worked for the World Trade Centers, as I said, doing all these things, saying, hey, I'm doing good work for the community and all the rest. But as it turned out, there was someone who was moving Oswald around New Orleans and helping him out named Clay Bertrand. And what Garrison came to realize was that Clay Bertrand was a pseudonym of Clay Shaw. And with that information, he started looking around and finding out what was going on. Well, Clay Bertrand, on the day of the assassination, and this actually shows up in the Warren Commission, had contacted a lawyer and said, I want you to go to Dallas and represent Oswald. So Clay Bertrand being Clay Shaw, it was Clay Shaw who was asking this guy to go represent Oswald for some reason. And as it turned out, he had also found that David Ferry and Clay Shaw had gone to Montreal in 1961 and had also gone together in 1962. Montreal is where Permindex was. So when he grabbed him and he charged him after Ferry had died, they charged him with conspiracy in the Kennedy case because he had witnesses who said that they had seen him and Ferry talking about the assassination. Then he had a live suspect who was connected to Permindex. He had to get into what Permindex was. Now, when he was looking, as I said, at Oswald's connections, he was running into all this aerospace stuff, and I go to Riley Coffee Company. They all said he was leaving for NASA. So we're talking about Oswald here, who's supposedly this low-level, $1.25 an hour worker in Dallas, Texas, pushing, it just happens to get lucky working on the motorcade route. Obviously, he's deep now coming up against this thing. And the thing that he's really running into is, in his determination, ultimately, coming out of the aerospace industry. So there's a guy Ned Hinkle, who for a number of years was the person who was in charge of Ramparts magazine, which is very interesting. It's kind of like if you think of Rolling Stone or the Village Voice or one of those magazines, like a real political edge in the 60s. And they had something like 500,000 in circulation. It was a very popular counterculture magazine. So it turns out that Garrison's going after this guy, and he's calling him nonstop, and he's saying, look, there's some things I have to tell you just in case something happens to me. And, this guy is getting so nervous talking to Garrison, he's starting to avoid him. He's running to places like the mailroom to avoid his calls, and Garrison somehow figures out he's in the mailroom and calls the mailroom. So he gets him on the phone, and he says, we were wrong when we originally looked at this case. We had this whole idea about Texas oilmen and, these different things that came up. And actually, the more I look into it, it's the aerospace agencies, the contractors, military inside the government. That's where the conspiracy to kill President Kennedy originated. This is on the record now. And
who said that? Did Garrison say that?
Garrison, yeah.
Who did he say that to?
The editor of Ramparts.
And that was printed?
Yeah, it's actually in the editor of Ramparts biography.
Wow.
Which is called If Life Gives You Lemons. But it is quite remarkable testimony. And
that editor, did the editor interview Garrison?
Well, what's interesting is in Garrison's book, he had interviewed him. There's two important interviews with him on the record. But after the fact of the interviews, he gets them on the phone to say, I have this hot information. In case anything happens to me, you have to hang on to it. And in fact, that editor talks about how things became uncomfortable for him after he started dealing with Garrison. So he knew Garrison was being closed in. So one of the two aerospace companies that he identified, one was Lockheed Martin, the other one was Boeing. Now, it's very, very strange because anyone who's looked into this case will tell you that Garrison, when he originally was looking at this, he saw that there was a character out there who he had learned was something he called a Boeing assassin. And this is Fred Chrisman. There's a couple of books that have dealt with him. And I don't know if there's any really good book on him. By the way, this is someone who used the pseudonym John Gold and wrote his own biography, which is pretty far out. But Fred Chrisman is a very interesting character. I'm going to spend a moment on him here. Chrisman is somebody who's connected deeply with the UFO file because he shows up in the Maury Island case, which is the case before Roswell, of these craft being seen off the coast of Washington and part of the craft falling off and hitting a boat. A number of strange things happen in this case, including the fact that the guy's son is kidnapped and he shows up in a town and working as a dishwasher, some 3 months later. It's like, I don't remember what happened to me. But what's interesting about all that is that, Chrisman is deeply involved in that case, which is tight, as a UFO case. And then later he shows up in the Southwest and he's connected around activities with Guy Bannister, who also is in this mix. And he's the person who's running Oswald, Bannister. And Bannister is the person who originated the X-Files for the FBI. He's the one who did Security X, and that's where you get all of those X things related to the UFO cases. He's using X steganography. And he's a person who shows up as a very right-wing figure, so the fact that he was running Oswald became unusual. But the fact that he also, he knew Garrison before any of this trial stuff also. So it's very strange. By the time Garrison gets around to it, he realizes that Guy Bannister was a huge piece of it. What happens is Bannister dies basically of a heart attack. And it basically, that is right after the Warren Commission report comes out. So they just want to get him off the board. And it was important, but he did his job. And one of the things that happened during Oswald working for him was Oswald was supposed to be attracting attention as an agitator and a communist, and he's passing out pamphlets. And he puts the address 544 Camp Street on the pamphlets. And 544 Camp Street is the address of Guy Bannister. He's not supposed to do that. And so apparently he takes some heat for doing that. But some of those circulated around, and Garrison got his hands on one and realized the connection between the two. That's why the whole story of Oswald as a communist and all that stuff exploded, because he was working for this right-wing guy as an insurgent, basically. An insurgent that was invading college campuses and looking for radicals and portraying himself as a radical who wanted to overthrow, America and do this whole kind of fair play for Cuba committee. So we have a very interesting setup there, because now we're looking at Jim Garrison on one hand running into this Permindex group, Permindex being connected to all these fascist activities around the globe and working tightly with people like George Bush and the Rothschilds. Now, it's very obvious in this case of the records that are out there that have to do with Bloomfield, and that the widow went to court over and over again to stop, and then the court overthrew that and said, no, you have to release them. They released a few of them and kept most of them. In those records now, some 69 files exist of his communications that have not reached the public. The last update I've seen on this case comes from last spring. But inside the communications of Bloomfield, who is the director of Permindex, could be absolutely crucial information relating to the JFK assassination. And, I often think that These people don't leave smoking guns behind. But there's a reason why these files are in play in the first place, and there's a reason why they initially were going to be let out and then they were blocked. Because perhaps it was going to be known certain things about the Kennedy assassination or connections. But then there was the clampdown was put in, and they had this weird thing with these files just hanging out. Now, I suppose the files could be altered, etc. However, they're no longer in the possession of the family. They're in this archive in Canada. So they're holding them. So again, we have this issue of stealth archives. The Maurice Phillips, who is the person who's been trying to get these records, the author in Canada, I have contacted him to try to get an update on all this, and we're going to be moving forward on it. I think it's a crucial piece because Permindex is deeply connected to space activities. They were deeply connected to this Lady Davis. And I'm going to read a little bit about Lady Davis and her very interesting background. And then I'm going to show some strange pieces of this investigation of the Bloomfield Papers. Before I do that, this is the Montreal Gazette. Actually, I'm going to read from it. But Miss Olivia, what have you got?
Quick question. So Eddie Stark wanted to know, do you think Dulles was one of the Majestic?
Yes, I think he was Majestic 1.
So nobody higher.
Well, no, I think they had to have the scientists. It's weird with the Majestic group, those who controlled the UFO file. The scientists were the top dogs because they got to do the analysis. But in terms of protecting the UFO file for their own purposes, the CIA had to be the top dogs. And Alan Dulles, it comes up over and over again in those records. In terms of who ran the UFO file, remember, we have on record that Vannevar Bush ran them and that he passed that on to Arthur Compton, and that Arthur Compton passed it subsequently on to others. So this is something where the leadership of the UFO file got moved, and we can track it on, remember, because a guy who was really a top physicist in America named Robert Sarbarker let us know the origin and how it played out. And he's like, it was originally Vannevar Bush, then Compton. They called in guys like Oppenheimer. They wanted to do this. And he even talked about how they were very interested in the bodies that they would find in relation to these crashes, that they were very much like insects. And that it was because of the lightweight quality of their bodies that they could handle the inertia and things like that. So quite interesting, the things that have been put on the record there. Yes.
Oh, there's just too many questions to go into.
No, it's okay.
I actually wanted you to address this one. Bohemian Exile says, it's just not logical that they have secret technology. SpaceX is the most advanced out there. What do you have to say about that?
Well, anything that's commercially available, it's a given they're 40 or 50 years ahead of it. That's just, it's well understood. There are witnesses who worked at the NSA in the 60s who gave interviews in the early 2000s and said that the computers they had publicly available then, these guys were working with in the 60s. So, they work with things in-house and they let them out to the public gradually. So they're always going to be ahead. Certainly the idea of advanced technology, they've been hiding that so well and under such cover for a long time that I think when we look at it, we have to be very realistic that they're so far ahead of us we can't even imagine. And I think one of the crucial things that they're working with, which is something that's in that X technology wheelhouse, is invisibility. And that's something where Trump had made some statements about it being invisible and got himself into trouble for doing that. And we've seen countries being banned from using them, like Turkey, for example, because we didn't trust them enough. Although originally we were going to. And then there's been a lot of strange things, including some odd crashes with the F-35s and malfunctions. I believe that's due to the invisibility, which is something that I think we started on with the Philadelphia experiment and perfected over the course of time. But it's not something that the public knows about just yet, unless you watch the show, of course.
So what happened to Permindex? Do they still exist?
Well, Permindex... he basically headed it up, but they kept getting thrown out of different countries. And so Permindex is basically like an archive now. And it's the archive of the work that he did there in Canada. And in terms of where those pieces, that fascist group went, probably deeper underground with a new name, no question about it. But Permindex itself, you know, I don't think there's any doubt about it in terms of the impact that they had. This comes from the Montreal Gazette, and the headline, I'll just give you the headline on that. Do lawyers' files hide JFK secrets? Bloomfield Papers, Montreal lawyer's widow asks federal archives to seal husband's documents for at least 25 more years. This was in 2007, and while the widow was still alive. Does the key to the assassination of President Kennedy lie buried in Canada's National Archives? Interesting place for it to be. Montreal researcher Maurice Phillips was pitted against Library and Archives Canada and the widow of once prominent Montreal lawyer Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. That's what we've been talking about all night. One thing is certain, whatever Bloomfield widow is trying to keep under lock and key out of concern for the privacy and reputation of Louis M. Bloomfield, in quotes, that was her response as to why she was doing this, it has left Canada's National Archives wrestling with a dilemma that goes to the heart of the question of who controls access to private documents donated to the federal government. A recent federal court ruling found that the institution cannot arbitrarily extend the restriction on access to Bloomfield's papers well past the original deadline set by Bloomfield himself. Now, the archives is struggling to decide to lift the veil of secrecy on papers that have been judged of exceptional interest to Canada. Quote, we're in the process of reviewing the whole issue, and upon having completed that review, we will make it known, said Francois Gagnon, spokesperson for the Library and Archives Canada. Now, he could not say how long that review is expected to take. What's interesting is by 2019, the spring report that I have, they had not released them. There were 69 files they hadn't released. Montrealer Harry Bloomfield, the nephew, says the fight to keep his uncle's papers behind the veil of secrecy is probably tying Bloomfield closer to the to JFK's assassination. And then it says, he says, it's absolute nonsense. They won't prove anything. And then he goes on to talk about Mrs. Cartier there. Now, she's very interesting and unusual character, very hard to track. At the center of the controversy are 31 boxes of documents that Bloomfield donated to the archives a few years before his death in 1984. A well-known lawyer who specializes in international law, Bloomfield was a pillar of several Montreal charities, including the Ready Memorial Hospital and Canadian Human Rights Foundation. This is great. So he's on this board with all these incredible fascists, including like the interior minister for Mussolini and these incredible people. And yet here he is. In addition to correspondence with many prominent Canadian politicians and with George Bush Sr., so it's a fact, they all agree that this is in there. The collection includes documents relating to a variety of charities in which Bloomfield was active, cases he was involved in, such as the attempt to bring Romanian King Carol to Canada as a refugee, and letters to Lady Henrietta Davis and her husband. Remember, he goes around the world being the kind of person who donates out of this Lady Davis archive. And it's this incredible money thing where he created this MIT in Israel out of this Lady Davis money. Now, they're the ones who are sending these, creating the technology to send these probes up to Mars and the moon. Now, so he talks about the Kennedy part, and he says, among the other people involved in Permindex was Clay Shaw, whom New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison suspected was part of a conspiracy to murder the president. These are also allegations Permindex was a front or shell company for the CIA that was used to funnel money for intelligence purposes. This is why I think fundamentally the this whole web has grown up around these records from Permindex and Bloomfield, because the CIA is involved and it would show trails of their money. I don't think we're going to get a smoking gun, but I think that there's something in here with Bloomfield, and there's a reason why he said in 20 years it'll be okay. He thought something was going to happen in relation to this. We have a stealth archive situation here. This is his X letter, in fact. One last thing I would say about this is that we know that the nephew, when he was confronted with the idea that his father was in the CIA, denied it, but it's on record. So there's a weird thing going on there where they're trying to spin their dad out of this mess, or their uncle in this case. And then I think at the very end of this article, they're talking about, maybe it's because they don't want to damage his reputation. Well, Phillips, who did the book, who's done the research on this, the guy in Canada, he argued that Bloomfield must have wanted the papers to be available eventually to the public, pointing out if he didn't want them to be seen by Canadians, he could have easily left them to his family or to the law firm. There's no reason for this whole weird push-pull. It was something in there. He was using it as a chess piece, perhaps, as I suggested, or there's something in there that he didn't think was going to be explosive, which is why the widow originally freaked out, and the archives now have held onto it 10 years after the widow's death. But in any case, those records, by law, just like the JFK assassination records, are mandated by law to be out. Think about this. In 1992, Congress passed a law that all of the CIA's records relating to the JFK assassination must come out. Trump was supposed to let those records out on October 26, 2017. We did a live broadcast on that day. We filmed the show with HBO on that day. The records didn't come out because the CIA came in and said to Trump, you can't do it. It's too explosive. And they were saying, oh, you need to protect names and sources and all this stuff. Half of the countries don't even exist that they were going after at the time, and all the agents are dead. So there's no rational explanation. Those records are supposed to be released in 2021, all right, 2 years from now, but they'll probably do the same thing again. These records were supposed to be released in 2004. The accumulation of our knowledge based on the stealth archives that are there that we actually know about and can actually get our hands on. Never mind some phony disclosure from a CIA group pretending to give you UFO reality, and like Louis Elizondo, with his tattoos coming at you, and with his phony lines about wanting to protect the Americans, and Tom DeLonge coming forward with this junk. The stealth archives is something we can get our hands on. There's no government entity. There's no BS $50 million corporation TTSA between us and the reality of it. So in the case here that we're looking at with Bloomfield's papers, we can get a lot of knowledge about Permindex, which Jim Garrison, who was the closest in the JFK assassination group, thought held the answer to this. And what else had he determined, according to the editor of Ramparts? He had determined the entire thing rested, that is, eliminating President Kennedy, rested inside the aerospace agencies, and identified Lockheed Martin and Boeing. That's explosive stuff. No wonder they keep the Garrison records under lock and key. No wonder these archives are outside of our control. Lockheed Martin and Boeing are incredibly influential, control most of the records in the federal government, will be the #1 recipient of the Space Force money for building their craft. These are #1 military contractors. They have too much power and too much influence. They can exert this kind of influence over these situations. This is where I think the rubber can meet the road a little bit, because in the case of the LBJX letter, as we said, some of that came out, but the rest of it's supposed to come out in 2023. This thing should already be out. If we can get our hands on some of these things, I think we can open up the story and we can send, the Bobos out. We've had a lot of Bobos in the secret space program. The Bobo was Corey Goode, and the Freak Show with David Wilcock, and all the nonsense secret space program, which I saw very up close from the way they were plagiarizing the work that we were doing on it. In the case of the UFO file, it's the TTSA who give you the circus show version of UFO disclosure, right? You get UFO disclosure, and here you can buy a guitar strap with it. And you have like fake
or hoodies.
Right, exactly. And you get Louis Elizondo, or Lou, and his new cologne, Lou.
All right, let me ask you a question. Brenda Fisher wanted to know, is TTSA the modern Permindex? And say, what would you say is the modern Permindex?
No, I don't think TTSA is. No, see, Permindex would use a company like that to do a puppet show with. Permindex is a very deep fascist organization, and I definitely would say, like, the Bank of International Settlements, things of this nature, fall more into the category of something like Permindex or the Gates Foundation.
Mm-hmm. That's what I thought immediately.
Yeah, these types of things. And, you can, because we have information on Permindex, linking them to fascist organizations, linking them to assassinations, we understand what they were all about. Things like the Gates Foundations, they masquerade as doing all these wonderful things for everybody. So it's hard. It's much harder. But, there are people who say that they are developing vaccines in Africa, not for such good purposes, shall we say. We saw with Monsanto. Monsanto, remember, originally had a wing which was like, hey, we're going to feed Africa. But instead, they wanted to give us Frankenfood. Now they're changing the name, right? Bayer bought Monsanto, so changed the formula. What was it? Frankenfish? It was the salmon, the genetically engineered salmon. I mean, no, just say no. Just say no to robot bartenders. There are limits. Okay, what you got?
Okay, well, I can ask a big one. Okay, Lashat wanted to know,
yes.
I never understood why anything related to the assassination of any president would be classified in the first place. Could you go over the justification for that?
Well, in the Kennedy case, it's obvious that the government covered it up. Everyone agrees with that. So now the thought is, well, they covered it up for good reason because they didn't want to get into war with the Russians and they suspected like Russian or Cuban involvement. I broke another pen. So there happens to be this kind of cover story. It's the cover story of the cover story. The first story is, oh, it was a lone nut and like he just did it on his own, whatever. And he just, he happened to get lucky with a gun that didn't work and the fact that he hadn't fired a gun in over 2 years. And then they had, the magic bullet and all of the joke, right, of that assassination. None of the official story holds up. I mean, it's literally like, I think the only thing that holds up are the names of the employees in the building. That's about it. But then the government moved to cover it up because the incoming administration was taking over. And so the way that I look at it is the forces behind the assassination needed to guarantee within hours that they had control of this story. So they had elements placed in the media, they had elements in the government, and there were a lot of very unusual things going on. Most of Kennedy's cabinet had flown overseas. They were on their way to Japan, and they had stopped in Hawaii. They had to turn around and come back. So most of the cabinet was out of the country. There were a lot of things that were just oddly timed for this to work. And interestingly enough, one of the stories that Professor Scott tells is that, a couple of days before the assassination, there were these tanks going down the streets late at night in the Dallas area. And when it was looked into later, they had said, well, we were doing like a Toys for Tots Salvation Army thing, we're dropping off bundles and things like that. It's a little early for Christmas, like a month early. Mm-hmm. But there was a military test run there in case anything got out of hand, and in case there was public protest or whatever it happened to be. But in terms of why they would cover it up, because if you conspire to kill a president, then a firing squad is where you're headed. And so they would cover it up for those reasons. In terms of why the media would cover it up, there were elements in the media that went along with it because the CIA was giving them that story, because the FBI was giving them that story. And so the Warren Commission people, when they put out the report, later there were recordings of them saying, well, I don't believe in the magic bullet, So they put it out at the time to make everybody kind of go back to sleep and to dumb everybody down. And when they asked Alan Dulles, well, should we release this report? He said, sure, it doesn't matter. The American people don't read anyway. But the thing is, they missed people like Jim Garrison, who was great at reading, and May Brussel and people like that who brought these things forward. So we know that the government lied. We know that the government lied in the case of 9/11. There was a commission where even the people who put on the commission, said, well, we couldn't get the truth because the government wouldn't give it to us. So you have a situation that's kind of schizophrenic where the people on the ground understand something, and as we get up to the 56th anniversary, anyone who's looked into the case knows that the government's version is fake. But the media, when we get there on the 22nd next week, they're going to play it out like, and disturbed Oswald, he got his gun ready and he did it. And like, it's such a tragedy. And, they're going to play it out that way, even though in 1979, the House Assassinations Committee, which was a congressional committee with subpoena authority, had gone through 2 years of this, and they decided it was a probable conspiracy. And they referred it to the Justice Department for further analysis. And it's funny because when I went back to Professor Scott, I said, what would you do this case now? What exactly would the steps be? And he literally said, you'd reopen the investigation. It would be a cold case investigation, and you'd reopen the investigation. That's the thing to do based on the new evidence. So this is the nature of the thing. If you want to really move the culture forward, yes, it's something that happened 56 years ago, but you would, one, correct the record, but also you'd open up a lot of those channels that happened and the influence that happened after the fact. So if the Kennedy assassination is the genesis moment that turned everything upside down in this country in terms of the kind of cycle of disrespect between the leadership and the citizenry, then it might just be the thing to do to poke a hole in it once and forever. Like these guys, can you imagine anyone with a brain in the media looking at this case and believing the official story? The official story is completely absurd. Yes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We are here on X Series 73. And we're going deep now. It looks like the power has gone out on that. You may want to check the plug. And it is NASA, Nazis, and JFK. Permindex. It's back.
Okay.
And the secret space program. Now, I want to say, like, the setup for the secret space program, I think, I've done a number of programs on it. I've given you kind of a quick overview on that one tonight because this is mostly about Permindex and the JFK assassination. But it's all about space. And you have to remember that even the questions that we get around the Space Force and Trump and the questions that we have on TTSA and Clinton show that these sides competing for the UFO file and for dominance in space. They're both looking for a space threat to grab more power, in a sense. When we look at Trump, it's obvious through his uncle, John Trump, who had, after all, examined for the FBI Nikola Tesla's papers. He knew a great deal and shared a great deal with Donald Trump. They were close. And that Trump had worked and been very close. I don't know why this isn't brought up more. Trump is a very close friend, was a very close friend of Richard Nixon's, and brought him to New York to hang out with him. And Nixon got an apartment on Park Avenue, and they hung out a lot. And I've shown the letters between them saying where he's telling him to run for president and he'll win. And then there's a very unusual picture that I show, which is John Connolly, who was in the assassination car, and he's there with Nixon and Trump in 1987. And when you're in politics, so let's say Trump or Nixon, you don't show up in a picture for nothing. You send a message with picture, you stand next to somebody for a reason. For them to be there with the person who was in the assassination car with Kennedy, I thought was a very unique picture, photo opportunity. So I think that we need to keep our head in that kind of way of looking at it. Yes, Miss Olivia.
David Tormina, DJ, do you think Trump is associated with Permindex? I found some info linking him to them.
Well, I'd like to look at it. I have that battery thing again.
Okay, I'll have to check on it.
So it is, and you can send it to info@darkjournalist.com, and I will take a look at it. I haven't found anything about Trump with Permindex, no, but they had those types of influences where certainly with things like real estate, the mafia, the CIA, their worldwide activities. That's good. That's good. Thank you. Okay. Bravo, Miss Olivia. Yes, I mean, there's certainly a lot of influences and overlaps when you get into things like casinos and real estate. But I haven't connected anything up with Permindex and Trump. It seems to me, I mean, it kind of feels like Trump's the kind of guy they'd want to get out of their way because he is like a bull in a china shop. Mm-hmm. So
right, he just runs his mouth off, right? You can't trust him with secrets.
Exactly.
So Esoteric 369 Wall wants to know, do you think Stanton Friedman's archives will reveal Permindex information as well?
There is a massive archive of Stanton Friedman's work. I'll tell you, Stanton understood the UFO file incredibly well. I don't think he was looking for things pertaining to the JFK assassination, and I don't think that's the kind of information that will be in there. See, this is the funny thing. These are great researchers that we're talking about, but they weren't looking at the things that we're looking for. And so we can lean into the great work that they've done and use it to try to understand the type of track that we're on in this X series, looking at these things. So Stanton's great information, and I've had a couple of deep interviews with him before he passed away. And he was extraordinary, his grasp of what the UFO file cover-up was all about. Much better than any of the kind of circus shows that we see on the History Channel.
And of course, Stanton was Canadian.
Yes. Well, he was living in Canada, and I think he was originally born in New Jersey, actually. Okay. But he was living in Canada, and he certainly, he was a no-nonsense guy. You know, he didn't go along with certain things that were in the Bob Lazar story because Bob Lazar had clearly lied about his education. It's just a fact. He said he went to MIT, and he didn't. But that doesn't mean I don't believe Bob Lazar's or parts of his story. It's just that he did lie about his education. But you know, Stanton was the kind of guy who would call that out. And unfortunately, you know, we've seen with the guy who did the film on him, they did a debate actually before Stanton died, and what's his name? Jeremy Corbyn, I think. Is it Corbell, the filmmaker? Yes. Mm-hmm. If you ever watch that debate, I mean, Corbell kind of freaks out because he's losing the debate to the great Stanton Friedman. And, you know, I just think it's interesting that some of the more skilled observers that we have in the UFO field who've been at it a long time, people like Knapp and stuff, will go along with the charade stuff that comes up, you know, TTSA, Elizondo, CIA. Those stories, I mean, these people know better. They based their careers on resisting the influence of the intelligence community over this, and so they can't lightly turn around now and start working with them. And, you know, unfortunately, we see it with people. Even Richard Dolan has been doing a lot of that with TTSA. I really think it's a bad turn, and I'd like to see them return to the kind of work that they were doing previously. It was much better. Yes. Okay.
Counter-Israeli espionage. Question. Any connection to Vatican and Permindex? Maybe the Vatican vault?
Yeah, that's it's a really deep one. What's interesting is there's a book called The Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Flamand, who's a remarkable and highly underrated researcher who passed away just before the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. And he tied Permindex very closely with the Vatican. And it is quite extraordinary, the level that he did that. What's interesting and what I find fascinating from my own perspective is that, you know, we have Bloomfield there in Montreal as someone who is an active Zionist and very interested in, you know, the Jewish heritage, working with all these fascists who, like I said, you know, the Hungarian prime minister who was exiled for his fascist activities, the interior minister for Mussolini. I mean, really a who's who of ex-fascists and sort of Nazi influence. So seeing those together and seeing that, you know, I'm going to read just a quick thing about Lady Davis's trust, so we understand what that was all about when I was talking about it. Because there is a tie-in here with the technology, but it's fascinating to me that he's there in Israel every year, and he is distributing her money to kind of create this Israeli MIT, but he's working with hardcore fascists who you would think that would not be, they would make strange bedfellows. So that I think is very interesting. Okay, so her husband, Lady Davis's husband, is Mortimer Davis. He was a Jewish Canadian businessman and philanthropist. The mansion he built in Montreal's Golden Square Mile has been renamed Purvis Hall and is today owned by McGill University. There's quite a few things we could say about McGill University in terms of their CIA activities. He was knighted by King George V, becoming the first Canadian-born Jew to receive such an honor. So real mover and a shaker here. And then it is his wife now who will have Bloomfield as her lifelong lawyer, distributing her money all over the place in this philanthropy. And he invests a lot of that money in this technical institute in aerospace in Israel. Davis left 75% of his estate for the construction of a Jewish public hospital in Montreal. So this is somebody who really knew about philanthropy. But his wife was an active philanthropist and made an officer and commander of the Order of the British, the OBE, the British Empire. These are very high-standing people in British eyes. She died in 1963. The Lady Davis Institute and the Lady Davis Mechanical and Aeronautical Engineering Center, a 7-story low-rise building in the Technion in Israel. That is, as we discussed the Technion earlier, that is the best university in all of Israel. It's like the MIT of Israel. 7 stories, Lady Davis. This is what Bloomfield was the executor of. So Louis Bloomfield is a lot of very unusual crisscrosses here, but I have to tell you a really strange one, being that this is the X series. We're going to dive into an esoteric element here, which is going to blow your mind. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. Let's say you're familiar with Heineken beer. How many people out there have had a Heineken before? Let's say there's a few Heineken drinkers out there. Well, it turns out that Bloomfield was the president of Heineken. He was the top man. Also, in addition to his legal activities and his distributing Lady Davis's estate and his CIA activities. And again, the CIA has ways of making these 5 guys in one. And Louis Bloomfield as the president of Heineken for many, many years. Now, there's a couple of strange things that come up in relation to Heineken, including the logo, which is a red star. But one of the very earliest versions of Heineken beer, you beer drinkers out there are going to get in on this one, and I'm going to need your help. Let's look at one of the original logos. Well, first I'm going to mention what the logo had on it, and we're going to take a look at it. That's regular Heineken beer logo. It's got that red star. Keep that red star in mind. It's going to come in handy in about 2 minutes. When you're having a nice, cool Heineken, take a good look at this figure, who is the Sun King, also known as Louis XIV, who thought of himself as the Sun King. Well, it turns out that Heineken was using a very obscure logo name when they started, which goes back to this. And there's another shot of that. It is NEC Pluribus Impar. That's the Sun King again. That logo, that term, is very interesting. We're going to take a look at what it means. Nec pluribus impar, literally not unequal to many, is a Latin motto adopted by Louis XIV in 1658. It was often inscribed together with the symbol of the Sun King, a head within rays of sunlight. While the motto relates to the allegory of the Sun King, its precise meaning is very obscure. Philip Riley calls it almost untranslatable. There's all these unusual ideas about what it was and what its use was. And it's interesting because King Louis himself talked a little bit about what it meant, but even that still unusual. He said, "I would be just as capable of ruling still other empires as with the sun of illuminating still other worlds with its rays."
Whoa.
Pretty esoteric description there. I think that there's something very strange about this. And here is something that he had set up at the palace with that Sun King. And this is Versailles, the palace that he put together where they did the Treaty of Versailles. But the Sun King head, I'll tell you, I started to wonder about the red star involved in the logo for Heineken. And the fact that Bloomfield was president of Heineken for so long started to stick with me, that there was a reason for it. And the Sun King aspect of the name of their logo, that they were using that name, started to strike me as very unusual as well. But I came across a very interesting piece of science fiction from 1908, right around the time that Heineken was using this. This, by the way, is the original Heineken logo, which bears that inscription, Nec pluribus impar. And again, literally that means not unequal to many. Original logo. There was a book that came out in 1908, kind of contemporaneous with this. And the book was called Red Star. Now, Red Star is by Alexander Bogdanov. It's a 1908 science fiction novel about a communist society on Mars. In 1908.
What?
Yeah, Red Star. Remember?
Who wrote this book?
This is Alexander Bogdanov. He was actually a physicist, a political activist, and an author. And he's writing previous to the really big revolution in Russia. But he published the novel Red Star about a utopia set on Mars. In it, he made predictions about future scientific and social developments. His utopia also dealt with feminine themes, which would become more common in later utopian science fiction, like the two sexes becoming virtually identical in the future, or women escaping domestic slavery and being free to pursue other relationships. Other notable differences between the utopia of Red Star and present-day society, including workers having total control over their working hours. The novel also gave a detailed description of blood transfusion in the Martian society. It's very interesting. Red Star and the basis that he describes in there became the inspiration for cybernetics. And they go very deeply into how this influenced this whole cybernetic train of thought, because he, remember, was a scientist as well. He immersed himself in writing a lengthy philosophical treatise of original ideas, Techtology, Universal Organization Science. His idea of system analysis was later adopted by cybernetics. And this is very interesting that he was able to look into the future like this. And the fact that the Red Star logo on Heineken continued this, and that eventually the Communist Party actually even adopted the Red Star for a number of political activities. Anyone who's well-versed in Bolshevism, Leninism, and all the rest of it is going to find that. There's something very, very unusual about that, and the technology that he described in there. The other thing that was unusual, which is that Voltaire when he was asked about this nec pluribus impar term, which again is on the Heineken logo, and the reason we're discussing it is because Blumenthal had this presidency of Heineken in Canada for a long time, in addition to all of his many other activities running this worldwide fascist organization in Permindex. Voltaire attributed it to the Spanish Netherlands, which I found very, very interesting. And when I went to look at their original flag, that's what I got. The very heart of exteganography popping up right in the middle of all this. So the next time we have a Heineken, we're going to be looking a little bit deeper at who the president of this was. One other piece I want to mention before I turn everything over to Miss Olivia is that, by the way, Larry King was involved in when Garrison was doing his original investigation and offered to do a fundraiser for him. And he raised all this money and made off with it. And that didn't go so well for Larry, who later wound up in prison for doing this. And he basically said, oh, I had a lot of gambling debts, and this is what happened. So sorry, Larry. Reality isn't always easy. The other interesting thing is, remember, this is Bloomfield, who ran Permindex with the Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion had a tremendous battle with the Kennedy administration, and Kennedy had told him in no uncertain terms that he could not develop nuclear weapons. And it was kind of like the way we were trying to keep Iran from doing it. And he said, you'll set off a Middle East process. And at a certain point, Israel had come up with a defense plan against Kennedy coming in and bombing the Dimona nuclear facility. That's how extreme those conversations were. There's a series of letters between Kennedy and Ben-Gurion saying, this is not going to happen, and you're going to dangerously undermine the relationship between the two countries. Interestingly enough, when Kennedy really put his foot down in this fifth letter exchange on this, Ben-Gurion resigned. And his successor continued the stonewalling, but it gave them enough time not to deal with the whole thing. And then Kennedy had said, we need inspection and we need containment of what you're doing with your program. And you can't be making nuclear bombs. So there are people who run away with the idea that Israel assassinated Kennedy, but I think what it shows is that there were forces, a coalescence of forces that could be collaborating in such an enterprise. And that Permindex, again, is interesting because it doesn't seem to observe the borders of traditional enemies. It seems like these enemies would collaborate together to get something done. And the name itself, Permindex, has always been a little bit unexplained. What it's supposed to mean is, doing these shows and expositions and things of this nature. But it seems to me, in my conversations with Dr. Farrell, that he presumed that it meant a permanent index of people to be assassinated who weren't going along with the program. That I found particularly interesting as a good insight. And with that, Miss Olivia, with Heineken on my mind, I turn it over to you.
Okay, my mind is blown. I'm having a really hard time keeping up with you tonight. So the Red Star, okay, yes. Everyone is relating to Red Shield, as in Roswell.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Also. Yes.
And obviously, communist symbol. Fox and Barrett Show wanted to know, question, at what point does cybernetics and transhumanism tie back to technocracy?
No question. Well, technocracy literally meaning that you're going to have a small group running the world with technology, and that they're going to elect themselves as these kind of overseers. And we see a lot of that when the corporations were trying to turn the world into a series of zones. They wanted the North American zone. This is part of why this immigration debate is so hot and heavy right now, because the corporations were laying on this idea that you could run Canada, the US, and Mexico as all one economic zone and forget about the Constitution and all that. The problem is America has a Constitution. Canada has its own thing, Mexico has its own thing, but the US Constitution gives us sovereign ability. And so the corporations don't like that, because that means you have to pay attention to things like free speech, which they want to censor. And it also means you have to pay attention to things like, so many individual rights and the freedom to worship and all the rest of it. This all goes against, they want to write their own competition, and they want to make their own constitution something really, like the Facebook things that if you say something that's offensive, you're out, So this is the PC police grown up with millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and incredible technology and data mining behind them. So it's a dangerous situation. It's not like other situations. I've had conversations with people who said, well, there have always been evil people in the world, and we've always had to deal with it, and it's true. But the problem is that they never had this technology. And it makes it a uniquely perilous moment in this sense for humanity, which is that we have to get control of this, ethical control of this runaway transhumanism. And if we don't, then we're going to be running into all sorts of issues over and over again, as we've seen, and the kind of dehumanizing that goes on. And that's going to lead society in a very regressive direction. So it's better to do it now and take it on now, for sure. Yes.
Thomas Tyson, what do you think of the gemstone file? Howard Hughes, Aristotle, Onassis, etc.
I'm doing a show on Onassis, so I'm going to get more into that there. But I've explored the work of Mae Brussell in relation to the gemstone file, and I think that she had it right, which is that there are aspects in there relating to Howard Hughes and the doubles that they used for Hughes that are correct. But then, it's sort of like, kind of like the Torbitt document. It leads you in a few different directions. One thing that I wanted to get into tonight, which we didn't really have a lot of time for, was in the Torbitt document, which is kind of like the WikiLeaks of its time. It was a strange release which covered all this information. And it came out in 1970, and it's Torbitt, and I believe that the name itself is a pseudonym, William Torbitt. Later, a lawyer came forward and said he was Torbitt, but it doesn't seem, it's not proven. But I do feel that the information in there is very important. But one of the things that he pointed out was that there was a group inside the government called DISC, D-I-S-C, and it was the Defense Intelligence Security Command. Now, he claimed that it was Werner von Braun that was the head of this, and that he was setting up a kind of planetary defense shield, and that this was where a lot of this kind of secret space activity was coming from, if you really read between the lines. But the people involved in DISC, according to the Torbitt document, which I do feel is important, were people like Clay Shaw and Permindex. They were interlocked with von Braun on this. So this idea of running the world from space was born inside this DISC group. And it's an interesting acronym if you think about it also, just in general. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Amanda Bear, how much did Johnson know?
Well, he knew quite a bit. He was known as Senator NASA because he was the person who was deeply involved with it. And so much of NASA was set up in Texas. And then also they have the Johnson Space Center and all the rest. And then in terms of the JFK assassination, he was certainly in a position to know that this was going to happen and he was going to take over. Remember, he was in a world of legal trouble and a number of bribes and other things. A number of his associates from his career in the Senate were going down, like Bobby Baker and Billy Celestes. And his last chance, like his ticket out, basically was the assassination. So certainly something. There's been a lot of information that's come forward about people pointing out LBJ's knowledge of the assassination before it happened, and also the way he was working with elements inside there. What's strange is just how closely he worked with von Braun also. Just incredible. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 73. It's great to have so many people here tonight. And we are going deep on the JFK assassination, Permindex, Disc, von Braun, NASA, Nazis, and JFK. Coming up to the 56th anniversary, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's the way we're going to stay in touch. And of course, the way things are going with social media and they're throwing everyone off the rolls, this is the time to do that. Make sure you're in that pipeline. What's going to happen is you'll get every Friday an email telling you what show is coming up and what guests we're going to have for you, and any events that will be coming up. You'll hear about them first, which I think is important. We have incredible guests coming up for you between now and New Year's. And also, while you're there, become a subscriber to Dark Journalist. You're going to want to subscribe to Dark Journalist because of the things that we have coming up in relation to the X series and in relation to the Hot Zone work that we're doing. You're going to want to be there first. So make sure that you sign up for that. We've made it very affordable for you. And go to darkjournalist.com and get yourself on there. Inside 2019 is the way to do it because you can lock in that discount for yourself. And it's going to be great for you to support the program and get behind the kind of work that we're doing here, which, is under siege, I would say, a lot, the way that things are set up now. And so we appreciate your support. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Thomas Tyson says Red Star equals Mars equals Aries equals war equals conquest. And Najat says, didn't Rudolf Steiner make a connection to Mars and China?
Oh, isn't that fascinating? Well,
where does Mars fit in with this?
Yeah, it is very interesting, actually. They always go for the idea of red Mars. And Red Star equals Mars, I think, is a very good observation because that book, Red Star, is all about Mars. And I think that this person who wrote it had a very deep understanding if his systems theory became the foundation of cybernetics, which is basically, that's how we make cyborgs and the whole transhumanist wave. The Macy conferences really moved along as well. But he's writing in 1908. Okay, so this guy's incredibly advanced. So something about that story and the Red Star that I think is fascinating. I think you're onto something. In terms of the Steiner China, I'm trying to think of Steiner talking about China. I know a lot of his comments about Russia and how Russians had very advanced ethereal bodies. So that psychic activity and things like that for people in that side of the world were a little easier to access. I found that very interesting, knowing how much that they do study it. So Steiner always, absolutely, it's still hard after a lifetime of reading him, still catching up with a lot of the knowledge that he brought forward. Yes.
Just a little aside, Just Me Living the Life wanted us all to remember that Freddie Heineken, I guess, who is the owner of Heineken, was on Epstein Island.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, that is fat. Well,
there's a lot more to research.
I have a feeling that Bloomfield is a big interconnection key. Mm-hmm. And I have to say I was aware of him, but I wasn't aware of the court case until recently. And I feel that the court case about his records between this Canadian archive and the public and the researchers who want that is very crucial. And that it could open up a lot. I think that we should keep an eye on it. I'm going to be all over this story coming up, and I've done some outreach about it, and hopefully we'll be getting some big answers on that. Yes.
Okay, so our Andrew is asking, what did James Forrestal know, and could you go into his relationship with Kennedy a little bit more?
Yeah, here's an interesting thing to think about with Forrestal is that a young Kennedy, before he was even in Congress, was taken to post-war Berlin by Forrestal, who was the Secretary of the Navy and was part of overseeing the redevelopment of Germany. And he took him there. They were both Catholics, and he was close to Kennedy. And his knowledge of the UFO file was pretty deep. And one of the things that Jim Marrs went to me with is that there was a group that was aware of the Roswell crash in that era, in 1947 after it happened. And one of the people that they went to in their records when he looked at it was John F. Kennedy. He was one of the only people that they reached out to. And so Kennedy had this knowledge of the UFO file early on. And then Forrestal, being a key man in MJ-12, the original real MJ-12, who Truman had selected to be in there and became the first defense secretary, he so soon after having that job has this mental breakdown and then is pushed out a window and suicided so early that we have to think that whatever was going on in the struggle of the UFO file, that he had an objection. And we've seen that there are stories that he communicated with one of the off-world beings that we had captured. Who knows if that's true or not? But it's interesting to consider it, considering his unusual demise being thrown out of Bethesda. It's a pretty harsh ending, and interestingly enough, there's that wonderful picture of Kennedy visiting his grave as president. And having that picture taken, that's also communication, I think, that he knows that he died for such a reason, and he was close with him. They had that camaraderie. So it is a fascinating story. Yes, Miss Olivia.
David Donaway, do we know of a direct connection from Permindex to nuclear fuel and the Manhattan Project?
Well, I have a connection between the original CERN, which, remember, it's a nuclear agency, originally set up in 1959. So CERN and Permindex have a relationship. Also, there's one of the original people who set up CERN is John J. McCloy, who was on the Warren Commission and part of Chase Manhattan and with that whole Rockefeller set. So that I'm looking for McCloy in with Permindex is somewhere that I'm trying to draw in. But that's a very interesting question, and I think that's the right place to go, actually. A lot of nuclear things pop up in relation to this reactor, Dimona, in Israel that Kennedy was opposed to, and thinking about how Bloomfield is so pro-Israel, helped set it up, helped train the Israel military force, donated all of Lady Davis's money there to the Israel MIT, is there every year. We know that there are some strange connections with certain CIA people to Israel too, like Jesus James Angleton. They erected this incredible memorial in Egypt, in Israel, to Angleton. And it's quite interesting to me because he visited there on a regular basis. So I know that he helped set up the Mossad, which is the Israeli CIA. But
in what year?
In the 50s, yeah. But I think that these are things that need a deeper look, because I think that there's a tension there with this Permindex group on one hand, and then the CIA Mossad influence on the other. That's not really well explored. Much better if we understand those groups and their activities. For sure. Yes.
Bethany Green was asking, wasn't there a connection to the owner of the theater where Oswald was arrested? Dow Jones Mueller responded, it's Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes.
Do you want to go into that a little bit?
He had originally owned it. He had sold it by the time that Oswald hit there. But the idea that he had owned the theater that Oswald was in is just, wow. But there are much stranger things about Oswald. The Texas School Book Depository being owned by D.H. Byrd is very unusual. Riley Coffee Company, NASA, so many interesting crisscrosses there. And then he's staying at the home of Michael Payne, who's the protege of Walter Dornberger, who is the ex-scientist. I mean, Dornberger is where we get the X planes. He did the X-15, which is the top X plane. It still holds the speed record, and it was made in the 60s for a manned space plane. Okay, so the kind of technology that he had access to. Dornberger is an incredible, mysterious figure as VP of Bell Helicopter. And so we think about Michael Payne, you know, and he's hosting Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, that connection, that moving connection there with Permindex and these fascist groups. This is what Garrison had run into. This is why the investigation is so unusual and why he's hit so hard. You know, why would the media be so upset that he was looking into the JFK assassination? I mean, yes, they had dropped the ball. They hadn't covered it. But ordinarily, the media would have been, you know, it would have been a great story, right? Hey, there were other people who were involved with this. We've got it. Why would you go all over this guy and just discredit him so heavily? It's because he's getting at their power base. And this is a major problem. Not that everyone in the media knows who they're working for, but they get their marching orders, you know. And I can tell you from being around that business that when the publisher, it doesn't matter what you're working on. If your publisher tells you to kill a story, that's it. And if you want to keep your job, you have to go along with it. And if you don't, you leave and become a dark journalist instead. So this is the way it works. Yes.
Okay, so the Bushes did not come up tonight, as far as I.
Oh well, they did. Yeah, he came up because Bloomfield has letters with George W. Bush Sr., who was also, remember, Bush Sr. is not only president and vice president; he is CIA director under Ford. So I'd be very interested to see the letters.
A lot of people think that he was there that day in Dealey Plaza. What do you think?
Well, here's what's on the record, and what I think is interesting. George Bush Sr. has always been unusual because whenever he was asked about where he was when the Kennedy assassination happened, he would always say, I can't remember, whereas everyone else remembers. Just like if you ask someone now, where were you during 9/11? They can remember, you know? So that's a weird game that he played. Second, he was friends with George de Mohrenschildt, and de Mohrenschildt was Oswald's handler. In fact, de Mohrenschildt wrote him letters saying, you know, de Mohrenschildt was an oil geologist in Texas who was, around all these millionaires, and he's hanging out with $1.25 an hour Oswald. It's a very unusual story. But the fact that Bush and he are friends, and that he's writing Bush letters later saying, hey, there's a dragnet like closing in on me. Can you help me? You know, people are bugging my phone or whatever. And then he winds up dead. There's a lot of, I mean, he was from Texas. He was part of this CIA milieu. And I think one of the biggest connections with him in the JFK assassination is the fact that he has this communication with Bloomfield. So I'd like to see more of that. I think that the Bushes are part of that wing that are responsible for the JFK assassination. Whether or not Bush Sr. had any role in it at that point, he was an oil man, and he was part of the CIA. He was getting close in with the CIA. Officially, they don't say he was there, but there's a lot of links that show that he was. There's a great book, actually. I'm trying to think of that author's name, but he wrote about the Bushes, and he does a site.
Family of Secrets.
Family Secrets, that's the book. Yes, terrific book. And there's a lot of crisscross with the JFK part, with Bush Sr. there, for sure. Yes.
Carol Casa, do you think Kennedy knew of the Eisenhower meeting with aliens at Holloman Air Force Base and the treaty?
Well, that's a very interesting story. You know what's weird? We were talking about Stanton Friedman earlier, and he gave me a lot of very solid leads that the Eisenhower meeting with aliens had a lot of plausible support in terms of people who had said that he had gone to this certain Air Force base unscheduled. But it could, we don't know. That's a really deep secret, of course. I think that the real fact is that Eisenhower told Kennedy about the UFO file and warned him about aspects of it. JFK held a deep interest in UFOs going in. And when we look at Eisenhower, when he's making the speech about the military-industrial complex, he already knows things are out of control. And when he's handing over all this stuff to Kennedy, he knows that, he has a lot on his shoulders. The alien aspect from from national defense, cultural, and all the rest of it would have to be on the table between those two. So I absolutely believe whatever Eisenhower knew in relation to the UFO file he shared with Kennedy. It was, being the commander during World War II and being president for 8 years, he would have. Absolutely. Wow. Fantastic questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show X73. We're deep, deep now on the UFO file and JFK and Permindex, which we've been on, Jim Garrison's incredible investigation into the JFK assassination, really pushing back against incredible pressures to get it done. And Garrison is a true hero. But what was the legacy that he left us? A lot of it had to do with Permindex and what this group was. And the person that he grabbed, Clay Shaw, as we remember, was on the board of directors. And that gives us the strange overlap between Permindex and the JFK assassination. What's interesting is, in Garrison's case, when he charged Clay Shaw, the jury let Clay Shaw off because they couldn't decide whether or not he was involved. But they, when they were polled and surveyed afterwards, they all agreed that Kennedy was killed as part of a conspiracy. And the one thing that's not often credited to Garrison, which I think is important, though, is that he was the one who got Time Life to release the Zapruder film. Before that, it was heard of, but it was talked about it, but it was never shown. And he was the first one who got it out there, which I think is a major accomplishment. And Oliver Stone's movie celebrates the basic aspects of his trial and his fight against JFK, although it doesn't go much into these deep parts. But yes, so we're going to take just two more questions.
Okay, now John Madry, does anyone have copies of Garrison's research? He wrote a couple books.
Oh,
right?
He wrote, yes, absolutely. You can start with On the Trail of the Assassins. It's a fantastic book and really covers quite a bit. Heritage of Stone is his blow-by-blow of the Shaw trial. And then he did a novel called Star Spangled Contract, where I think he let out certain things that he couldn't let out writing officially. But his work is absolutely remarkable. And there's a good Playboy interview from 1967, oddly enough, which holds up very well, giving us some idea. And the Ramparts magazine interviews with him also were quite good. I definitely think that Garrison, he was the one who really got close on this, which is why he was put down so hard and discredited so heavily. But he survived, and he survived even to make a cameo in the JFK Oliver Stone movie as Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Justice. That's pretty good. All right, the last question. I just want to say
one of the most powerful things is him in his deathbed. He's dying of cancer, and he just reasserts what he believes. Yes. He had balls to the end. He's amazing.
Garrison is one of a kind, but he'd been through World War II. He'd been in Germany. He'd seen death camps. So he knew what the stakes were. And I think that's an important thing to point out. And we have to remember this guy was a lieutenant colonel. He was an FBI agent, and he was also a DA. He'd been around the block. And we owe a great deal to him in terms of what he went through to get the truth out. And you still see the mainstream media take shots at Garrison every time the assassination anniversary comes around.
My God, did they ever?
They're still offended, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
well, actually, and I hate to say this, when you mentioned it earlier that what we're going to have to put up with about the anniversary of the assassination, the fact of the matter is, after the 50th, they put it to bed. They don't even address it anymore.
It's true. They try to really tamp it down, and they just love. If the CIA as an agency, their biggest point of exposure for anything they've ever done is the JFK assassination. And so it diminishes them. People kind of fundamentally understand, I don't know if it's a subconscious level, the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency in the JFK assassination. And so with their control over the media, for them to not, if you do a survey now, and 70% of Americans don't believe the official story, and most of them don't believe that Oswald did anything. So that's a big failure on their part, that with all the money and with all the media that they have, the misinformation machine, they were not able to convince people that this took place. It's important because as history goes, covering that up sets back culture dramatically. Because if you think of the world that Kennedy was moving us toward versus the one that we got, then you can see what was at stake. So it's very important for us to know what was lost and how to go forward properly. So I think this is the real key. So when we have these things about people running around saying, well, this Cuban or that mafia guy, forget about all that. The crux is what Kennedy was doing, the space aspect, and the CIA. Those are the elements. It's that deep state connection there. And remember, Garrison's idea was, it was in the aerospace agencies. So it's important for us now where they're taking such a central role. One last question, Miss Olivia, to bring it all
David
home.
Tormina. DJ, do you think the X technology itself could have hypnotized those who unleash it, causing them to commit murder like a form of possession? I mean, like the will of Ahriman entering through nuclear implosions.
That's very deep. Yes. I don't think, like, the best way to understand the X technology is through the lens that we look at things in this program, which is to say esoterically. So it has a physical aspect, yes, but it has, just like the action of an atomic bomb, it has a metaphysical counterpart. So we have to understand both. But when we get around X technology, look, if that's in the UFO file, what happens in UFO cases when people get around these ships or these beings, whatever it happens to be? When they get involved, those stories come back to us, and all these unusual things happen to them. They lose their will. One, they get put to sleep. They forget things. They lose time. So they lose physics, right? So there's a physics distortion. We call it apotheum on this show. That is, I think, a fundamental understanding about this, which is it does have an influence. And so the X technology isn't just some alien thing that we reverse engineered. It seems like it's been recovered and carried through the mystery schools, but it's been discovered by people like Tesla and John Keeley, who, they tapped into it. So it's this kind of, I think even the Ark of the Covenant has some aspects of that story sound like apotheum to me. It has all the signature of this. So I think it's an excellent point that it's not only a physical reaction, it actually takes on a whole spiritual dimension as well. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think we will say goodnight for X73. Everyone go now to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, and make sure that you stay in touch with us, because that's the best pipeline where we get that direct back and forth going. And the social media networks are great, but they're here today, and who knows about tomorrow.
I'm going to throw you last question.
Yes.
Okay, Andy B. Did Ruby get injected cancer? Because we could do a whole show on that.
Ruby's very interesting, and we have some interesting things coming up, including Joseph Farrell on this subject. So they're going to go more into Ruby. There's a whole section about mind control and Jack Ruby in Farrell's book, A Microcosm and Medium. It's very interesting. Ruby's a very unusual figure and really held a lot of the keys to this whole thing by eliminating Oswald. But I think that the cancer that he got was so fast acting after he had just gotten a new trial that they had the ability to give him cancer 100%. I absolutely believe that he was given the illness that he got. Everyone, thank you so much. It's been terrific. X Series 73 tonight, going deep into that 56th anniversary of the JFK assassination, a very important transition in the culture, a dark step, and something which I think many people would say we never quite recovered from because we never got the truth on the matter from official sources. However, there have been incredible people who dedicated many hours, days, and lives to this, and I've been fortunate enough to know some of them, and they're very serious about their research, and they know how to eschew the junk conspiracy and get to the good aspects, and also to eschew the false official story, which was always a sham from the beginning. And we have to understand the crux of this is that Kennedy was eliminated for a very good reason, which is on their side, they could not go forward with their plans with him in office. That's the fact. And however you want to attribute it to, some people will say it's the Federal Reserve. Some people will say it was the UFO file. Some people will say it was a combination of what he was doing with the oil depletion allowance, and the oil millionaires didn't like that. He was making very big changes. And he also didn't want to go along with this war machine. He had a vision of peace. And I think if we were living in the society that he was crafting, we'd be a lot further down that road. But he left us a great legacy. And he said, what kind of a world do we want? What kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana hoisted on the world by American weapons of war. This is important because that's not what we're after. And so whether it's Trump saying that space is a war-fighting domain, or Clinton, and trying to create a war with Russia or whoever else she could get her hands on, those are not the ways for us to go.
Right. He understood that the ends do not justify the means.
Yes.
He embodied that.
Absolutely. So thank you, everyone. Remember, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, become a member of Dark Journalist, and definitely get on board with us. We have some great things coming up for our members, and you can do that all at darkjournalist.com. We will see you next week, and have a fantastic
weekend, I have to thank some super chatters.
Yes.
Okay, so James Belch, William Quimby, Igor St. George's Butler, Harry Henderson, Amanda Bear, Jimmy Parker, Epright88, and Doyle Wayne. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We definitely appreciate it. I see Grandma Tippy Toes out there. It's great to see everybody. Liberty Thunder, there he is, the man himself. Jim Roy, it's great to see you. Olivia Wings girl, but there you are, Miss Olivia. Great, you did fantastic questions.
No, I've been hungry the whole time. Blood sugar.
Now you're talking. We will see you all next week. Space Ghost, it's great to have you there. Groovy Bean, terrific. Gigi Young, I saw you earlier. Lee Veltman, terrific. Esoteric 369 Wall, it's fantastic to have you out there. Najat, I know Kate is out there watching too. I didn't see her on this one, but hello, and I thank you for joining us. Stephen Vanderlaan, Thomas Tyson, and around we go. Fantastic crowd tonight. Great questions. Thank you. This is an important one. I'll have a Bloomfield update on this also from some of the outreach that we've done here. This is inciting, everyone, because I think there might be something genuinely interesting and explosive inside of Bloomfield's documents if we can get our hands on them. And I'm definitely looking for a new update on that.
Catherine Harris says, and the show never stops.
It's true. Jay Mallett, Catherine Harris, Richard Warner, fantastic. Brian, it's great to see you. We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Miss Olivia, you get the last word as usual.
I don't know whether to have tacos or pizza. We've been talking about them in the chat. They both sound great.
Go deep into the mind.
Remember, I think the crunch of a taco could be very good right now.
I'm going to end the broadcast, but it never really ends, as we can tell.